Chapter 694. After a while, a hint of surprise and shock flashed across President Pabre's tanned face. No one knew what Minister Zhou said next to his ear, but Mr. President's eyebrows furrowed more and more. There were signs that he was going to be angry. Seeing this scene, the high-ranking officials of the Federation in the conference room suddenly tensed up. They looked over there hesitantly, not knowing what was going on. In a tense atmosphere, no one noticed Councilman Matt, who was waiting for the military to be humiliated. Councilman Matt's face was extremely ugly. He angrily protested, "Minister Zhou, can you please show me some respect?" Zhou Yingxing was slightly stunned. He sat up straight in his chair, carefully put the thin metal glasses back on his nose bridge, looked at Councilman Matt politely, and then slowly explained, "Mr. Councilman, it's not that I don't respect your words, but there are some changes to the things you just mentioned." Speaking of this, Minister Zhou's voice suddenly became cold. He continued, "The person who testified against Colonel Su Lo, Colonel Lake, because he is involved in a serious criminal case, he will immediately face charges from the Ministry of Justice. The validity of his testimony is very questionable." Within the West Woods military region, which had a good relationship with Su Lu, there was actually a high-ranking officer who took the initiative to testify that he was a wanted criminal of the Federation. Then, before the coffee turned cold, this high-ranking officer was suddenly involved in a serious criminal case. Not everyone in the room could see what was behind this drama, but they were very clear. It was very clear that when one side started to show their power, the federal military, especially the Department of National Defense, who was standing behind Su Lu, also started to show their power. As Minister Zhou's voice fell, Mr. President nodded in agreement. The door of the conference room was pushed open again. Under the leadership of Su Songzi, the officer from the Internal Affairs Department of the Department of National Defense walked in front of Colonel Lake expressionlessly and unlocked the handcuffs. Su Songzi took out the electronic legal document and read it out without any change in tone. "Colonel Lake, you are accused of participating in a murder case in the 67th year of the Constitution. You are accused of participating in the 68th year of the Constitution. Slander." In a quiet conference room, Colonel Lake's angry roar burst out. He stared at Minister Zhou and shouted, "I protest. You are persecuting them. Shameless." Senator Mace was so angry that his whole body was shaking. The National Security Advisor frowned deeply. Minister Zhou Yingxing's expression was solemn. He said to the people in the conference room in a deep voice, "Everyone, it's best to hear clearly what the Ministry of Defense is accusing Colonel Lake of, and then decide if your response is appropriate." Hearing this sentence, Colonel Lake thought of something. His body trembled slightly, and he suddenly looked back at the electronic legal document in Su Songzi's hand. His face instantly turned pale. "Colonel Lake, you are accused of illegally stealing secret data from the Bureau of Proclamation in the 69th year of the Constitution. You are accused of illegally stealing and leaking important data of the Federation. You are accused of destroying a Federation Class 1 aircraft. You are charged with endangering public safety by dangerous means. You are charged with violating the Federation's military data regulations." Colonel Lake, Judge Su Songzi closed the electronic document and stared blankly at Colonel Lake, who was tightly handcuffed. She slowly said, "I will accuse you of intending to subvert the Federation. I will accuse you of collaborating with the enemy. I will accuse you of betraying the country. I will accuse you of murdering the commander of the Federation's West Woods military region, Zhong Shouhu, and his wife, as well as 1372 Federation soldiers on board in the 70th year of the Constitution. I will ask the military court to sentence you to 7 death sentences to be executed by shooting." The words were not very powerful, but they came out of Judge Su Songzi's mouth slowly and firmly. However, they carried an extremely shocking power. Every time she said a crime, Colonel Lake's face became paler, until the 3 crimes of collaborating with the enemy, betraying the country, and murder quietly hit him in the chest. They hit him so hard that he was silent, and his eyes wandered in confusion. As for the big shots in the conference room, they were so shocked by the crimes that they could no longer sit still in their chairs. They opened their mouths and slowly stood up. In the end, only a few people could still sit. They knew that these crimes must be supported by very solid evidence. Otherwise, the Ministry of Defense would never choose to suddenly launch an attack at this critical moment. The attack on the ancient bell, the death of the tiger from the West Woods, and the firework. There was actually a conspiracy behind it. That tragic scene was about to be reopened. What kind of price would the murderer hidden in the Federation pay? And what kind of price would the Federation, which urgently needed stability and unity, pay? Colonel Lake, who had become a wax puppet, did not make a single word of defense for these serious charges at the hearing. He tightly pursed his lips and numbly let the military judge of the Ministry of Defense escort him out. Su Songzi lowered her head and glanced at the black sunglasses in her hand. She took a deep breath and drove away the strange feeling in her mind. She saluted to the President and General Myers and lightly walked out. President Pabre stood up and quietly looked at the crowd. He did not say a word and just left the conference room. And this silence represented a very profound meaning. The road where the temporary traffic control was carried out was very empty. Several dark green military vehicles of the Ministry of Defense were quietly parked on the side of the road. At the end of the road, there was an expensive car with its door open. Fatty Tian held Zhong Huiyan's hand and stood motionlessly beside the car, waiting for someone to arrive. The military judge of the Ministry of Defense escorted Colonel Lake out of the back door of the small building. When he walked to the front of Fatty Tian and Zhong Huiyan, he subconsciously stopped. Fatty Tian twisted his plump eyebrows and looked up at the sky unhappily. After a moment of silence, he said, "Why?" Colonel Lake was silent for a long time. Then he raised his head firmly and proudly and answered with a smile, "Of course, it's for the Federation." "Good answer." Fatty Tian narrowed his eyes like a steamed bun with too much yeast, squeezing out extra cracks. He said softly, "I will go back to the Ministry of Defense with you. You know what I am capable of. There is no possibility of you committing suicide, so don't try to do those unnecessary things." Colonel Lake's face changed slightly. As a trusted subordinate of Commander Zhong for many years, he was very clear about what kind of terrifying means this seemingly harmless fatty in front of him had. It was said that a regiment commander of the Empire had fallen into his hands and actually screamed for 3 days and 3 nights on the battlefield without stopping. He closed his eyes and swallowed a mouthful of saliva. He turned to look at Zhong Huiyan and said with great difficulty, "I'm sorry, Mississippi." Chapter 695. An agent from the Federation Bureau of Investigation in a black suit hurriedly ran over from the other end of the corridor. He didn't have time to wipe the sweat off his forehead, nor did he care about the complicated looks of his 2 colleagues at the door. He immediately rushed into the bathroom, took out a roll of soft paper from his pocket, and knocked on the closed door of the cubicle. He panted and said, "I've brought the paper. Do you need anything else?" "No, thank you." A hand reached out from the cubicle, took the roll of paper, and closed the door again. The agent from the Federation Bureau of Investigation finally had time to take off his tie, wiped the sweat off his forehead, and calmed his anxious breathing as he slowly walked out of the bathroom. Hearing the light knocking sound from time to time in the bathroom, the agent guarding the door frowned and asked, "There shouldn't be a problem, right? Don't worry too much." The agent took off his black suit and opened his collar. He shook his head and replied, "If he wanted to escape, how could we stop him?" "Then what was that sound?" The agent crumpled his black suit into a ball and put it under his armpit. He tilted his head and listened carefully for a long time. He said in confusion, "It seems to be a roll of paper hitting the door. What I don't understand is why the colonel is still used to using a roll of paper in the bathroom." Another agent said with a shrug, "Su Lu sat on the toilet for a long time. The cold white porcelain had warmed up, but his heart was still as cold as ever." There was a famous line that was very suitable to describe his feelings at the moment. What a fucking shit life. Of course, there was no shit here. Squinting his eyes, he threw the roll of paper at the door in boredom. Watching it bounce back in a way that didn't conform to the laws of physics, his right hand reached out as fast as lightning. No matter where the roll of paper tried to fly, it couldn't escape from his 5 fingers. The day before yesterday, he was a hero of the Federation. Today, he was a wanted criminal of the Federation. This difference didn't make him feel too uneasy. What really made his mood worse was that in order to deal with the big shots, he had to expose Colonel Lake in advance. Shi Qinghai was the first to raise questions about the internal affairs of the West Woods Military District. With the help of the central computer, Su Lu slowly got closer to the truth and found out the sinister and despicable role played by Colonel Lake. Shocked and angry, Su Lu had prepared a battlefield punishment for Colonel Lake in his plan. According to the punishment customs of the army for betrayers, whether Colonel Lake was sentenced to death or life imprisonment, it would probably be a kind of relief. In the plan, Colonel Lake was supposed to be the last one to be exposed. Now that he was exposed ahead of time, even if he was still alive, the rest of the clues would be cut off. Due to the uncertainty of the future, the faint uneasiness of the verdict, and the two reasons regarding Colonel Lake, Su Li's mood was somewhat low. Treasure fish soup. It's not very accurate to call it soup. The half in your right hand is raw dipped in mustard sauce, and the other half has fatty skin. We've prepared white soup to simmer. It should taste good. The Federation Investigation Bureau agent in charge of taking care of Su Li's daily meals was now dressed in a black suit. He introduced the dishes for lunch in a serious manner. His tone and attire made him look like a waiter in a restaurant. Sula didn't have much of a reaction. He used the tip of his chopsticks to pick up the thin, translucent piece of fish. He felt the tenderness inside and directly put it in the mustard sauce to wrap it in a big circle. Then he put it in his mouth and chewed until his veins popped out. He was sweating profusely and his eyes were gradually bloodshot. "Do you want some wine?" The agent at the table was shocked by his silent but slightly arrogant expression. He subconsciously murmured, "It should taste good with some highly pure white wine." Su Lu shook his head and used the fastest speed to finish the crispy fish slices in front of him. Then he picked up the wash basin-like noodle bowl in front of him and used his long chopsticks to stir the noodles. He quickly stuffed the plain noodles with bright peppers into his mouth and mixed them with the soup. The sound of the noodle slurping filled the entire restaurant. The bowl of noodles was eaten with a sense of heroism. The Federation Investigation Bureau staff stared at the table in a daze. Looking at this important prisoner, they couldn't understand how Colonel Su Lu could still have such a good appetite in such a tense situation. Su Lu put down the bowl as if he had completed a mission that he had to complete. There was no satisfaction on his face. He suddenly asked, "Have you been on a battlefield?" "No." The Federation Investigation Bureau agent shrugged. He didn't understand why he suddenly asked this question. "I've been on the front lines." Su Lu suddenly smiled and looked at him as he said this. The agent thought to himself, the entire Federation knows, and they've all seen how you were on the front lines. So this is a useless question. Su Lu seemed to be deep in thought. He frowned and continued. After the 65th year of the constitutional era, the logistics of the Department of National Defense entered the best period in history. But as you know, on the battlefield, who can guarantee that all the supplies will arrive on time? That's impossible. In the heat of battle, it's very common for food supplies to be cut off. At that time, ammunition is much more important than compressed biscuits. He lowered his head and looked at the few sticky strands of noodles left in the bowl. He looked at the fish head that was just beginning to bleed on the delicate porcelain plate and said, "So when we can eat, we try to fill ourselves up as much as possible. As long as it doesn't affect our movements, we should fill our stomachs with as much as we can. My personal habit is to bring compressed energy bars, but that's another story." He tilted his head slightly, thinking about that annoying feeling of hunger after every mecha battle. He couldn't help but laugh. There's also the problem of going to the toilet. He looked at the agent and said very seriously, "There are toilets in the base, but not on the battlefield. It's even more impossible to have self-cleaning nozzles, Chrysanthemum brand men's personal perfume. It's already good to have a roll of toilet paper. You should know that we often take the uniforms of the Empire's corpses to wipe our butts." The 13th floor once said, "The uniforms of the Imperial Expeditionary Forces Snow Armored Brigade are the most comfortable to wipe our butts with." "Colonel, what are you trying to say?" The agent looked at him curiously. For a young employee like him who had just entered the Federation Investigation Bureau, Sulu in front of him was a legend they worshipped. Even though he was currently under investigation and might become a prisoner, that dizzying sense of legend still existed. So he was very curious as to why Colonel Sulu would be interested in talking about something that seemed completely unrelated after dinner. What I want to say is war, the battlefield, comrades, troops, the influence these things have on a person. Su Li's eyebrows gradually furrowed, and he said slowly, as if unwilling to recall the past, "On the battlefield, the last thing I want to do is count the number of people. Yes, our 17th Division, starting from the old division, is best at eliminating the enemy while escaping. It's called preserving the strength of the living to better attack the Empire's people. But everyone knows that it's because we're afraid of death. But no matter how afraid we are of death, there will always be people who die. You should know that I was in Group 7 at that time. Every time we went out on a mission and counted the number of people, there would be some names, but no one would answer. Fuck, this is really unpleasant. You haven't been on the battlefield, so you haven't seen people die so easily. How could it be easy? Well, for example, look at that colleague of yours in front of you. Yes, that Mr. Director of the 4th Department, he just walked out of the elevator. Walking out of the elevator is a very common action, but on the battlefield, he's already dead. Why'd he die? No one knows. Maybe it's the redundant program of the mine-laying mecca that caused a grenade to be left here. Maybe it's a small mudslide, or maybe it's just a stray bullet. Sulu carefully wiped his lips clean, shrugged, and continued. Dying on the battlefield is like going to the toilet. It's a daily occurrence. Going to the toilet and eating are two different things. The young agent looked nervously at his superior, who was walking over. He held back his laughter as he retorted, and then stood behind Sulu. Anyway, you guys have seen too few moments of life and death, so you're used to overcomplicating things, Sulu said. Is it very complicated? The director of the 4th Department, whose face was deformed and looked particularly gloomy, slowly walked in front of Sulu and said coldly, I really want to know, what kind of simple principle did you learn from the battlefield? Sulu looked at him quietly and suddenly said, the principle I learned on the battlefield is other than life and death. Everything else in the world is irrelevant, including learning from traitors, being wanted by the Federation, are also irrelevant? The director's slightly raised eyebrows were slightly angry. Sulu put down the napkin, stood up, looked at him, and said, if I'm not wrong, you're here to tell me the good news that I can leave. If that's the case, then the things you accused me of are irrelevant. I have to remind you, you're only being released on bail. The director of the 4th Department suppressed the disappointment and anger in his heart and said coldly, we have enough evidence. I believe that in a few days, I will see you in a military prison. There's no such possibility. Sulu looked at his face and said calmly. This answer was very simple and clear, and even a little unreasonable. Whether he would be sent to the military prison or not was a matter for the court to decide, but his attitude was so direct. Tell the adults behind you. He paused for a moment and said seriously, the principle I just said on the battlefield can actually be said in a different way. Kill me, or hurry up and die. Leaving this calm but powerful sentence, Sulu took the military cap from the young agent and carefully put it on. Then he walked out of the building without looking back. Outside the building, there was a line of cars waiting for him and countless reporters waiting for him. Under the deliberate arrangement of some people, the news media of the Federation had already heard the news. Once this incident was exposed, the entire Federation would fall into an unbelievable state of shock. After that, what kind of complicated emotions would be projected in the eyes of the people who originally saw Sulu as a disciple and a hero? He, who was accused of being wanted by the Federation, was temporarily released on bail and gained a few precious moments of freedom. The important people standing on the other side almost immediately began to destroy all possibilities of his freedom. Chapter 696. The building belonged to the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation. The automatic revolving door on the ground floor was magnificent. Sulu stood behind the door and looked at the falling snowflakes outside the glass. The reporters who were stopped outside the cordon were so excited that their facial features were distorted. They slowly stopped in their tracks, and a complicated expression appeared in their eyes. Crawling into the mine, climbing onto the broken car, breathing rapidly, the dark walls of the alley and the dirty underground water, he escaped from Dong Lin and came to the capital ring. From then on, he hid his identity as a wanted criminal and lived in silence. However, he never forgot about this matter. For him, the identity of a fugitive and his mentality of isolation had always played a role in places that he did not even notice. For example, at this moment, looking at the emotional reporters outside the door, looking at the cold snowflakes, and looking at the Emperor of the Imperium, he actually wanted to retreat. This was not the front line. Gu Shifeng and the other team members were not behind him, and He Lei and the other military officers were not beside him. The world outside the door was shocked, and the sky was filled with snow, but he was alone. I thought about what you said just now. I feel that I should sign up and join the army. The young agent from the Bureau of Investigation of the Federation draped a dark green military coat over his shoulders and said seriously, "But I don't know how to go through this process." Sulu came back to his senses. He lowered his head and fastened the collar of his military coat. He replied seriously, "The Department of Defense has a special recruitment program. A government official with professional skills, like yours, will be at least a second lieutenant." The young agent smiled gently. He nodded and saluted. He walked to the door and blocked the sensor with his hand, making the expensive revolving door turn. He said to him, "Understood. Take care." Sulu shrugged and walked out. Instantly, snowflakes and coldness hit his face, making him subconsciously tighten his collar. Then, countless dazzling flashes and sharp interrogations suppressed the flying snowflakes and coldness and hit his cheeks violently. He could not help but narrow his eyes. It was not the narrowing of his eyes when he wanted to explode or kill, but the narrowing of his eyes when he wanted to escape. But why did he want to escape? The uncle was the Federation's most wanted criminal. He was a traitor, and this was a suspicious matter. So what if he was a wanted criminal of the Federation? Back then, when Colonel Lake, who was wearing sunglasses, pointed a gun at his forehead, he had inexplicably started to flee. He had not done anything wrong. Thinking about that, Su Lu frowned and tried to open his eyes. Looking at the dazzling lights in front of him, he took 3 deep breaths and calmly walked forward. Slightly lowering his head, he prepared to say a few words to the dense microphones. He did not want to argue with the reporters, but he wanted to say a few words to the people of the Federation who cared about him. Just as he was about to carry out such a naive response, hundreds of burly men in dark-colored, tight-fitting combat suits suddenly appeared out of nowhere. These burly men wearing sunglasses with cold faces controlled the situation as soon as they appeared. They blocked the reporters who were about to go crazy behind them. At the same time, they protected Su Lu and quickly left from the side of the stone steps. These burly men's movements were very clean and neat. They looked like professionally trained soldiers. Su Lu quickly recognized their identities from the black eagle on their epaulets. Naturally, he guessed who arranged this. The Black Eagle Company, one of the 3 major security companies of the Federation, had always been the private property of the Tai family. The spacious black car was as warm as spring. The wind, snow, and noise of the outside world were completely isolated. Under the precise guidance and control of the Black Eagle Company, no media broadcast vehicles of the Federation could keep up with their motorcade. Even the 3 helicopters in the sky responsible for the live broadcast were forced to land under the obstruction of the Black Eagle Company's combat helicopters. It's a big scene. Su Lu took off his military coat, looked at the thin young man leaning against the window, and said, "Did Madam agree with you doing this?" Mother didn't agree with many of your methods, but since there was a conspiracy behind the explosion of the ancient bell, she naturally wouldn't allow those people to get rid of you too quickly. Tai Ziyuan was holding a glass of wine with no more than 20 degrees in his hand. He leaned against the window tiredly and looked at him and said, "This has nothing to do with interests. It's only about balance. After all, the old man is old, and the family is counting on you to be able to withstand the pressure of those crazy people in the future. Sulu shrugged and looked at the other corner of the car. Zoyu, wearing a red fox fur coat, was leaning against the leather seat. Her black hair was simply tied up with a plain-colored silk flower braid. It was particularly eye-catching when matched with the flame-like coat. "Be careful of the HTD Bureau," he said. Zoe didn't care about him at all. Her beautiful and charming eyes kept looking out of the window, and the flying snow flashed quickly in her crystal-clear eyes. The atmosphere in the black car was a bit strange. Tai Ziwan and Zoe had been sitting at opposite ends of the chair, looking out of different windows. They didn't talk, only silence. Because of the past of the Crown Prince's concubine selection, and because of the past of being desk mates in primary school, this strange atmosphere was easy to understand, but Su-Lu could accept it. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "You haven't seen each other for a long time, but you're sitting together because of me. Should I feel honored?" Tai Ziwan smiled and took a sip of the wine, but Zoe looked at him coldly. Su-Lu shrugged innocently, looked at the female military judge in the co-pilot seat, and said with a smile, "I heard from Lawyer Shao that you got married last year. Can I find a chance to make up for the wedding gift?" Su Songzi, who had been busy with the relevant judicial procedures, heard this and looked back at him in surprise. Zoe could no longer maintain her current lazy posture. She sat up straight and stared into his eyes in a daze. With a trace of coldness, she murmured, "You're really crazy. Get your facts straight. You're now a fugitive wanted by the president and 30 million Federation coins. You're not the guy in the documentary. You can be taken back to jail at any time, and in the next moment, your reputation can be ruined. In the end, you're still worried about how long it's been since I saw that sickly person, and worried about what wedding gift." Zoe stared into his eyes in a daze. She became more and more agitated and shouted, "You're an idiot." It turned out that the so-called biting cold strength was the strength of a shrew who didn't swear. Once the woman in red started to swear, then she was just a very beautiful young shrew. Sula looked at her by the window and smiled. When he thought of this, his heart and body felt very warm. He cast a comforting look at the sickly person, then gently patted her shoulder and said, "It's okay. It's okay." Tai Zuan held the wine glass and said with a bitter smile, "You're actually the student of Mechanic Yufeng. He's the most wanted fugitive of the Federation, the most notorious traitor in history. How can this be a small matter? I believe that just today, who knows how many people in the Federation will be scared to death by this matter. At least I was scared, and it's obvious that Yuzi was scared too. So the squatting soldiers and the S1 people were all fake. I really don't know how you escaped to the Capital Ring, and why the Federal Central Computer gave you such high authority." Taizuan stared at Su Li's eyes and said emotionally, "I'm really stupid, really. Back at UA University, when you were able to enter the H1 section of the library, I should have guessed your relationship with Professor Jean. Although not many people know his identity, my family does. That's why I'm really stupid, really. I was stupider than you back then. I only found out that his name was Professor Jean after I entered UA University." Sulu said softly, "Sorry, I didn't mean to hide it from you guys, but the identity of a fugitive doesn't sound good." When the convoy returned to Wangdu Apartments, these young people realized that they had underestimated the power of the Federation's media. The usually quiet garden under the youth's apartment was now bustling with noise. More than 10 high-frequency broadcast vans occupied many corners of the public green space. Reporters in formal were holding microphones, talking to the station's senior officers while explaining the current situation to the Federation citizens. The convoy's arrival immediately caused a commotion. The reporters changed the camera angles while shouting loudly, "Colonel Su Lu has appeared. We really want to know if he really is the student of the traitor Yufeng, if he really is a fugitive wanted by the Federation. How will he face the cameras and the citizens behind them?" When the news was released, the entire Federation was shocked. The military god, Li Pifu, had personally chosen this person to be his successor. The most respected war hero in the Federation in recent years was actually the most wanted fugitive of the Federation, the student of the traitor mechanic, Euphome. Even he himself had always been wanted by the Federation government. In the building of the capital's Special Administrative Region's daily news, a special program was being broadcasted on the screen. Due to pressure from the government, the Federation maintained temporary control over the news channel. However, the other dozens of television stations that belonged to consortiums or purely private companies spared no effort in reporting news related to Sulu. No one even cared about the troops on the front lines who were preparing to return home. Some television stations had already begun to connect with the Donglin region. The frontline reporters took recent photos of Sulu and interviewed many people on Clock Tower Street. Those unemployed miners who were as honest and direct as rocks gradually gave many unfavorable memories of Sulu. Reporter Wood, who had half of his but on the table, shook his head and said, "When I was in school, my teacher once said that news is always stranger than fiction. Today, I finally received some degree of proof." Editor Bob lit the coarse tobacco and blew out the match. His expression was calm, but deep worry. He wanted to find a deeper political reason from this explosive news, but he found that he lacked first-hand information. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "The student of a traitor is not necessarily a traitor. This is a very simple principle. I don't understand why the Federation is so agitated. Because this is a topic of discussion. When it comes to things like anti-heroism, many people are easily agitated and even angry." Wood shrugged and rubbed his knees that were still sore. He said, "What do you say in terms of law? The people won't agree. I really want to know how this matter will develop." Editor Bob's gaze pierced through the smoke and fell on the young colonel who had just gotten out of the black car on the TV screen. At this moment, the office door was pushed open and a middle-aged military officer walked in. He looked at the two surprised people and said with a smile, "Hello, I would like to book an interview on behalf of someone. Please forgive me if it's a little abrupt." Reporter Wood asked doubtfully, "Interview? May I ask who you are?" "Let me introduce myself. I am Han Xiaodong. I am now in charge of the 3 extras of the logistics department of the 1st Military Region," the officer said politely. It sounded like a very ordinary department, but it made Editor Bob stand up in shock. As a senior media person, he certainly knew that the so-called 3 extras were actually a specialized organization in charge of Philadelphia in recent years. The editor took down the coarse tobacco and asked in disbelief, "We want to interview the marshal." Chapter 697. Snowflakes continued to fall from the lunar eclipse signboard. Wearing a thick black windbreaker, Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood rushed out of the door against the wind and snow. Under the astonished gazes of their colleagues, they got into the dark green military vehicle. The military vehicle headed to the military airport in the southern suburbs of the capital. In the car, Wood glanced at the thin cigarette in Bob's mouth and felt the confusion and shock in the other's heart. He shrugged and asked, "Have you seen the military god before?" "Many years ago, at the funeral of the old president, I saw him from afar." Chief Editor Bob looked at the rapidly passing snowflakes outside the car window. He frowned deeply and took a deep puff of the cigarette. Suddenly, he realized that because he was in a hurry, he took the wrong pack of women's mints. He cursed under his breath and snapped the thin cigarette between his fingers. Subconsciously, he twisted the cigarette into shreds that danced in the air. "You are very nervous." Wood rubbed his sore knees, stared at the shreds of tobacco falling between the chief editor's fingers, and said in disbelief, "I never thought that the most famous, calm, and even cold chief editor of the Federation would be nervous before interview. You have interviewed 3 presidents before and after. Why do you care about this?" "The president is often interviewed, but the general has not been interviewed since he returned to Philadelphia." Chief Editor Bob waved his fingers and retorted. After a pause, he laughed self-deprecatingly and continued, "Well, this is all fake. I'm just nervous. When I was in the journalism department of Capital University, I interviewed the then Minister of Defense, but what is this? I still remember that year, the Capital Student Union and the Veterans Association jointly held a demonstration. In the end, there was an idiot from the S2 oil mixture laboratory who burned the general's portrait. Oh, at that time, the general was not the general, but a teacher. Just like Su now, he was a war hero and idol that the Federation focused on cultivating. That idiot was angrily beaten into a pig's head by our students and the veteran in the wheelchair. Editor-in-Chief, Bob, laughed out loud. He didn't care about the shaking of the high-speed vehicle at all. With a trace of reminiscence and a trace of indescribable emotion, he narrowed his eyes and said emotionally, "You don't understand what the Marshal means to us people in the 20s and 30s. As a journalist who needs to maintain an independent spirit the most, I shouldn't worship anyone. But just now, when the officer said that we could interview the Marshal, I realized that I've been secretly worshiping him since college, like a fanatical groupie." Wood shrugged, took out a Blue River cigarette, lit it, and said, "Isn't the whole Federation like this? But have you ever wondered why the General arranged this interview at this time?" Bob slightly frowned and looked out the window at the military airport building and the aircraft hidden in the building that were getting closer and closer. He said, "I also feel that this matter is a bit strange. Maybe it has something to do with what happened to Sulu today." The whistling air blew on the tarmac for 9 days. The powerful driving force drove the high-speed aircraft to instantly tear through the cold winter sky and flew in the direction of Philadelphia. After a short 10 minutes, the two famous reporters who only had time to bring simple interview equipment and even forgot to bring professional cameras arrived at the most famous lakeside manor in the Federation. The security measures in the lees of Philadelphia were extremely tight. The direct security forces of the first military region of the Federation were scattered around the building. The strong elite soldiers vigilantly watched any movement with sharp eyes. Whether it was the silent frogs in the fields or the fish in the pool that became lazier and lazier due to the cold, they could feel a tense atmosphere that was completely different from the past, permeating and eroding around the manor. As a fanatical admirer, I have traveled to Philadelphia twice, and I also learned about the structure of the Lees Manor through periodicals. The winter here is much warmer than the capital, especially this lake. Don't think that the blue water is clear and cold. In fact, it is mixed with a lot of mountain hot springs, and the temperature of the water is very pleasant. Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood followed Officer Han Xiaodong and received a strict security check. They walked into the manor, and the tense scene they saw along the way made them feel inexplicably nervous. In order to dispel this uneasiness, the chief editor began to explain everything to Wood in a hoarse voice. "Please come in. I won't accompany you. When you come out, I will wait for you outside." Han Xiaodong took the two reporters to a house and left with a smile. Before he left, he explained, "The room behind the door is temporarily within the scope of the Federation's data confidentiality regulations. I don't have the authority to enter." "What kind of secret is inside?" Bob and Wood looked doubtfully at the closed wooden door in front of them. In front of them was a smooth, dark, and expensive wood floor. They hesitated whether they should step on it. After all, this was the best, most persistent, and most daring news partner in the Federation. In the end, they stepped on it and slowly opened the door with unprecedented nervousness. There was no warped metal mecha full of interstellar sci-fi flavor, and there were no countless big shots whispering to each other about space strategies. There was only one room behind the door. In an empty room, there was a bed at the end of the room. The bed was covered with a thick but soft and comfortable bedding. A thin, haggard, and tired old man was lying in the middle of the bedding that was spread out like clouds. The dark brown spots were particularly eye-catching on the loose skin of the old man's face. The old man's eyes were tightly closed, and the corners of his pale lips drooped weakly. Perhaps it was because he had used too much energy on the battlefield, but the old man looked so tired. He was so tired that he didn't know if he had fallen asleep or if he had fallen asleep forever. More than a dozen extremely thin medical data lines were connected from the old man's shriveled body, and then they went around the head of the bed and into the space next door. There was a huge glass about 3 meters high that separated this empty room from the space next door. On the other side of the glass, there were more than a dozen of the Federation's most sophisticated and advanced medical equipment, more than a dozen of the Federation's most outstanding medical professors, and more than a dozen of the most important generals in the military. They were busy looking at the data and tracking the physiological indicators. They were helpless, angry, and roaring in despair. The soundproofing effect of the glass was very good. Bob and we could see the very familiar twisted and gloomy faces of those military big shots. They could vaguely guess the meaning of their actions, but they couldn't hear any sound. This scene was like an absurd mime show. But the problem was, who in this universe could invite so many high-ranking generals of the Federation to be actors? Understanding something, Bob and Wood couldn't help but breathe rapidly. Holding the recording pen tightly, they stared blankly at the thin and old body on the bed. They didn't know what to do. They knew very well that everything they saw was definitely history, and it was probably a point in history that would never be forgotten. As long as the Federation still existed, this scene would be recorded in the Federation's textbooks forever. As news reporters, it was the greatest honor to be able to appear at the scene of history, let alone this kind of history. But in the hearts of these two outstanding news reporters, there was not a trace of professional excitement, nor a trace of expectation. There was only endless nervousness, frustration, and fear. Sit, this is a one-way glass, but it's only one way for me. I don't like to lie here naked for them to observe. Although they are doctors, I'm not the great teacher of the Empire. At this moment, a hoarse and low voice suddenly sounded in the empty room. The thin old man on the bed suddenly opened his eyes, looked at the two reporters at the door, and said, "I like to see them busy in there. It feels like I'm back in the old battlefield. When I first joined the Army, I liked to see those weak medical officers carrying healing pods and running. Hee hee." 2 sofas were prepared at the foot of the bed, and fruits and brewed green tea were placed on the coffee table. Next to the glass ashtray, there were 2 boxes of white box ginseng that were specially provided in the Army. Bob and Wood didn't react for a moment. They stared blankly at the old military god on the bed. After a long time, they said hello in a panic and then stumbled to sit on the comfortable sofa. "I'm very happy that you agreed to come for this interview," Li Pifu, who was half leaning on the bed, said gently. The old man's hoarse voice had a strange sound of rubbing stones. It was still firm and powerful, but it was also a little scary. Wiping the beads of sweat on his forehead, Chief Editor Bob took a series of deep breaths, stabilized his mood with a strong sense of professionalism, and answered seriously, "Marshal, this is the biggest honor since I started working, and even since the founding of the Capital Special District daily newspaper." This was true. From this scene, a certain inference could be drawn. The interview that was about to begin might be the last interview in the life of the living legend on the bed. Bob and Wood were very grateful to be able to participate in this. Since it's an interview, I think it's necessary to introduce myself first. The thin old man said slowly. The light in the ward was very bright, and there was no sense of sadness at all. It was just like his legendary life, magnificent from beginning to end. Bob squinted his eyes and took out his favorite pen and paper. Wood gently turned on the recording pen and listened carefully to the hoarse voice coming from the bed. "My name is Li Pifu, and I was born in Philadelphia. I worked 3 jobs in my life. Before the age of 12, when I was practicing in the self-cultivation hall, I worked as a part-time cleaner. Later, when I was 14, I worked for a short period of time as a lawn mower in Philadelphia's East Court Square. Later, I joined the Army. Since then, I've been a soldier for the past few decades and haven't done anything else. When I first joined the Army, my squad leader fell to his death during a drill. The superiors were very angry, and I don't know why they chose me, a new recruit, to take over the position of squad leader. From squad leader to platoon leader, then to company commander, battalion commander, regiment commander, and division commander. In the end, I was promoted very quickly in the Army. I've never been a deputy, nor have I been a brigade commander or an Army commander. Speaking of only having worked 3 jobs 10 years ago, after I retired, I wanted to continue cutting grass in the East Court Square, but I was rejected by the government in the name of safety. As a veteran, I'm very dissatisfied with this." Chief Editor Bob stopped recording and looked up at the Army god on the bed, who was immersed in his memories. He thought with some uneasiness and sadness. Compared to Sue Lee's incident, this was a real news event, a news event that would make the whole universe sad. Chapter 698. Wangdu Youth Apartment, the core area of the news event, was surrounded by countless news media. Cameras and microphones like long guns and cannons were held in the hands of the reporters, showing off everywhere. According to the latest information from Blackhawk Security Company, several apartment buildings across the street from the youth apartment had even been rented by several major TV stations. There were already sophisticated cameras aimed at Su Li's room and began to take photos without stopping. With the wide sunglasses on his nose, Su Li, who got out of the car, had no expression on his face. The equally indifferent Zhou Yu looked through the dark brown lenses at the green space, trampled by the reporters. Thinking of the happy pregnant life in the apartment back then, she couldn't help but curse in her heart. Colonel Sulo, Colonel Sulo, do you have anything to explain about the accusation of the Federation Bureau of Investigation? Colonel Sulo, are you really from Donglin? Look here, look here. Colonel Sulo. The nervous and excited reporters were like a tide beating the security personnel of Blackhawk Security Company. Sulo quickly walked into the building. The neighbor's little girl, who was squeezed behind the crowd, saw him and excitedly raised her arm to greet him, but was stopped by her mother. The mother looked at Su Lu embarrassedly and smiled. Su Lu couldn't help but smile back to show that he understood. They finally got rid of the reporters and rushed into the elevator. However, they did not expect that there was a male reporter who looked more symbolic, quietly lying in ambush in the elevator. He quietly put the microphone under Su Li's chin. Colonel Su Lu, I'm a reporter from Gongdu Financial Times. The reporter excitedly wiped his sweat and looked at him and asked, do you have anything to explain about your relationship with the Trader Yu phone? Do you have any comments about the Trader Yu phone? The Trader Yu phone. The elevator was very quiet. Only the reporter's seemingly normal, but in fact extremely vicious questions could be heard. Su Li's face was expressionless as he focused on the floor lights. Listening to the slight friction of the mechanical springs, Zhou Yu couldn't help but take off her sunglasses. Her beautiful and charming eyebrows gradually furrowed. The fragile human body kept colliding with the hard walls of the elevator. The whistling sound of the punches was accompanied by the painful cries of the reporter, such as cliché words like hindering the freedom of the press. However, the beating did not end until the reporter was bruised and swollen like an injured girl, hugging his head and crying in the corner, no longer daring to say anything. Waving her hand to stop the beating of the Blackhawk security personnel, Zhou Yu slightly lowered her eyes and looked at the reporter at her feet without a trace of emotion. She said, you should know me, so don't talk nonsense. Otherwise, I will report to the police that a reporter tried to molest me. The reporter from Gongdu Financial Times suddenly froze and looked at the beautiful woman in red who walked out of the elevator in fear. He couldn't get up for a long time. Media reporters were best at sniffing out the wind and then following the will of society to beat the dog when it was down. That was why he dared to interview Su Lu so arrogantly at close range. However, he was very afraid. What would happen if he molested the daughter of the Minister of Defense? In the apartment with the curtains closed, there was a fierce, intense discussion. Everyone had different opinions about the accusations against Su Lu, but they all agreed on one point, that this incident would bring an irreversible blow to Su Lu. The case itself is not a problem. Su Songzi calmly looked at the case file and said, Su Lu, whose citizen number starts with DL, did not leave a biological marker, so we don't have to worry about the prosecution bringing up a biological marker comparison. Su Lu stood silently by the window, lifted a corner of the curtain, and looked at the carnival of news media downstairs. He didn't know why, but his mood became unusually calm. From Su Songzi's words, he could clearly feel that people had already determined that he was the Donglin orphan fugitive, but it was not convenient to say it out loud. Don't worry about this. We can completely reject the application for a biological marker comparison. Sitting on the sofa, he stared at the screen on the workbench with a serious expression and said, they won't be stupid enough to let the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense lead the case. They will definitely use the District Procurator Office. Colonel Su Lu is an active soldier, so his identity is very convenient. And the Bureau of Proclamation is not willing to provide any evidence for this accusation. Su Songzi spread his arms somewhat curiously, looked at Su Lu by the window, and continued. That is to say, the prosecution can't find any evidence at all, except for the testimony of the residents of Donglin Zhonglo Street. But the problem is that the testimony of these witnesses is not absolutely valid. Tai Yuan's identity was special, so he quietly left halfway. Lawyer, he quietly joined the crowd, listened to Su Songzi's words, and nodded. There can't be a jury. Absolutely not. The testimony of these witnesses is useless. Lawyer, he raised his head and said with a smile, appearance, voice, anything, we can give an explanation. Coincidence. All of this is a coincidence. Will anyone believe it? The law will. Let's take 10,000 steps back, even if the prosecution can convince the court to believe their accusation. After a long silence, Su Songzi looked at Su Lu and said, not to mention that you are just a wanted criminal. Even if you were a murderer, according to your contributions to the Federation, according to Mr. President's character, he will pardon you. Su Lu, who had been silent all this time, turned around, his back against the light blue curtain, his thick eyebrows slightly knitted, and said self-deprecatingly, no matter what the court's verdict, no matter whether the president will pardon me or not, I am now a wanted criminal, a student of a traitor. Then, secretly, I may also be a traitor. I don't study psychology, but I know this. There was a deathly silence in the youth apartment, including the custody of Little Watermelon, the lawsuit of the Zhong family, and today's matter. Thank you for your arrangement. Without you, things would have become more troublesome. Su Lu held the phone with his head tilted, his hands moving like a phantom as he cut the fish fillets at a high speed. He thanked Tai Ziyuan seriously on the other end of the phone. I have to admit that you do have a natural leadership talent in coordinating the overall situation. But according to the current situation, by the day you become the president, I may have already been driven to some remote place in the countryside. Yes, I will be a farmer with Gao Lu's father. The worst result is that Mr. Pabre will pardon you. Tai Ziyuan's calm analysis came from the other end of the phone. If this is really the case, then you can't be a farmer. Mr. Pabre is the president, not the former emperor. If he wants to pardon you, he must make concessions in other aspects. Su Lu tilted his head. The knife in his right hand subconsciously stopped. He narrowed his eyes at the pieces of red fish on the chopping board and asked, some things are crimes, not politics. We can't make concessions. You're talking about the attack on the ancient bell. In your opinion, it is murder. But don't forget that for most people in the Federation, except for the people in the West Woods, Zhong Laohu's death or sacrifice at that time is a matter of universal celebration. Everyone can benefit from his death. It has only been more than a year since the explosion of the ancient bell, but it is actually a long time. It is enough for people to forget a lot of things. People like this kind of violence that most people secretly look forward to. People enjoy the consequences and hope to forget the process. What you're doing now is to remind people of this incident. Tai Ziyuan's voice sounded particularly cold and sharp on the other end of the phone. This is a very dangerous thing. Even the president of the Federation can't go against the entire Federation. Look at your situation now. You just try to get involved in this matter, and there are countless shadows standing in the dark corners reaching out and messing with you. They want to ruin your reputation now, and you're going to ruin it soon. Tai Yuan said in a low voice on the other end of the phone. If you don't take a step back, they will kill you, and I believe you will die soon. The people who can kill me haven't been born yet. I can easily find those guys standing in the dark corners, so they should be afraid of me. Su Li's right hand moved again. He used the sharp knife to cut the fish on the chopping board and answered softly, if they really push me too far, some things can just be done again. It's not that difficult. Such a cliché, simple, and prideful self-awareness, coming from the mouth of this small-eyed man, sounded so natural and abnormally valiant. This violent force made Tai Ziyuan on the other end of the phone fall into silence. Su Lu placed the 5mm thick hand-cut fish meat on a porcelain plate, paired with fresh lettuce leaves, and drizzled with fresh cream sauce that could be found everywhere in the market. Satisfied, he washed his hands and pulled out a toolbox with a password lock from the sink. The toolbox opened, and a bright metallic color with a chilling, murderous intent rushed out. Sulu carefully examined these guns for a few seconds, then began to quickly and silently assemble them. He had an extraordinary talent for mechanical work, and he also received special training from Bayulan, so it didn't take him long to make a complete set of cold guns appear on the kitchen floor. These guns were prepared for the assassination a few years ago, but at that time, Secretary Bai stole too much ammunition from Whitewater, so she hid some in both of their houses. The phone that was placed next to the sink rang. Sulu put it next to his ear and asked, "What now?" "I heard the sound." Taijuan angrily reprimanded on the other end of the phone. "What are you going to do? Fight? This is the Capital Special District, not the Empire, and not the front line. Those guys over there are not going to fight, and you're going to kill them? Who are you going to kill? How are you going to kill them? You want to clean up the Federation government by yourself? You think you are God? Even if a narcissistic butcher like you thinks you can do it, what will happen after you clean up? Don't forget, we are still at war with the Empire. Those people are not Macklin, and you're not the guy who has nothing, so you are not afraid of anything. Think about the frontline troops. Think about the president who has high hopes for you. Think about the old man who gave up his old face to shake hands with you in front of the whole universe. Then what do you think I should do now?" Sulu angrily said into the phone. "With the current situation, even if the president pardons me, do you think I can still go back to the 17th Division? Do you think I can still lead the secret investigation of the Ancient Bell? Tai Ziyuan, no matter what the court decides in the end, I am a wanted criminal, a fugitive, and a student who committed treason. No one can change this." He looked at the guns by his feet, and after a moment of silence, he said, "I'm already stinking on the streets." Chapter 699. You stink the streets like a pile of dog shit, so you're angry. You picked up a gun and prepare to kill. "Colonel Sulu, I need to remind you to calm down, or to be more clear-headed. How many years have you been a Federation hero? Why, now that you've suddenly become a fugitive, do you feel embarrassed?" Tai Ziyuan mercilessly mocked him over the phone. "You can't stand being scolded, and you feel that you're very smelly. In people's impression, you're a cold and hard rock that can't be persuaded by force or persuasion. Why do you become so sensitive now? Is it because of that documentary and those medals that you've almost forgotten your surname?" "Yes, I do like the feeling of being a hero." Sulu raised his dark eyebrows and said loudly into the phone, "I'm just a normal person. Who the fuck would rather be a fugitive than a hero? I was nervous when the flashing lights shone on me, but I was secretly happy. I didn't watch it on TV, but I was happy too. Why? I braced myself and did all those stupid things. Can't I be a hero? And the result? The result? I'm not even a fart. I'm still that fucking orphan on Donglin Street. That little fugitive with a dusty face. Do you know what the fucking worst thing is? The most fucking worst thing is that the fugitive uncle that you always thought was carrying a blood feud is actually a fucking traitor. Then what am I? A little traitor?" Sulu laughed nervously and then cursed softly. The two ends of the phone fell into a long silence. Only when the automatic water heater in the kitchen sounded a warning did the two young men wake up with a start. "All right, I'll pretend that I can understand your current state of mind." Even at this moment, Tai Ziyuan still maintained the reserved and condescending attitude of the crown prince of the Tai family. "But you have to calm down immediately and put away those guns. You have to admit that the situation now is different from before. At that time, Macklin was already preparing to escape, but now your enemy obviously has no intention of escaping. This means that you still have a lot of time to make a decision." At this time, Sulu had already calmed down. He quietly listened to Tai Ziyuan's analysis. He sighed and said, "I understand." "Very good," Tai Ziyuan said. "You don't have to worry about the legal issues. I'm thinking of asking those old people from the Institute of Justice to come forward and write something about the time limit of the arrest warrant. If this can be done beautifully, then the prosecution won't be able to do anything. As for the reaction of the media and the public, I have also made arrangements. I will choose the right time to release the news that Colonel Lake is suspected of murdering Commander Zhang. In this way, the accusations against you will naturally be weakened." Sula listened silently. He knew in his heart that if the lady in the back mountain of Macho was really willing to help him, then the current situation he was facing would definitely be effectively resolved. "Thank you," he said seriously. "You should thank me," Tai Ziyuan replied. After hanging up the phone, Su Lu was in a daze for a while. Then he kicked the box full of guns back into the sink. When he looked up, he saw that Zhou had walked into the kitchen without him noticing. At this time, she was holding a metal fork and tasting fresh mulberry fish slices with sauce with relish. "You really have the confidence to use this box of guns to clean out the Federation government." Zhou used her index finger to lift the floating hair on her cheek. She carefully chewed the sweet and tender fish meat and vaguely joked, "I know that sometimes you are very confident and arrogant, but I really didn't expect that after staying in the Empire for more than a year, you would be so arrogant to this extent." Su Lu smiled and didn't say anything. He cracked 4 fake eggs into the metal bowl, poured in corn flour, and began to stir vigorously. The pale yellow egg juice spun faster and faster in front of his eyes, gradually drowning the image in his eyes. It was the highest level accurate map of the Federation. 4 locations were marked on it, representing the Vice President Byron and several other important people in the government. With the help of the Federal Central Computer, Su Lu believed that if he risked his head, he might really have a chance to clean out the Federation government. After a simple dinner, under the dazzling light of the camera outside the building, Su Lu began to squint his eyes and watch TV. Zhou had returned to the Shishan compound. The lawyers had returned to their respective homes, and the security personnel of Blackhawk were all outside. He was the only one sitting alone on the sofa, looking at the complicated expressions of the news anchors on the screen, the residents of Donglin who were being interviewed, the gloomy expression of the Federation Bureau of Investigation who warned the public, and the guests who worriedly mentioned how, when a Federation hero was involved with a traitor, what kind of impact would it have on the security of the Federation. He was a little tired, and a little unwilling. At this time, he unexpectedly received a call from Zhang Xiaoming. Since they parted ways at the Lu Feng Slope Club, the two hadn't seen each other for a long time. The scene of the conflict between the old lovers on the terrace seemed to have made the young man and woman feel relieved about each other's first love. But in fact, who could be relieved? So they rarely contacted each other, until now. "I've been to the S2 cemetery. I heard that you and Shi Qinghai both went there the next day. It's a pity that we didn't meet. I know that you're in charge of some work now. Pay attention to your safety." Because the phone could be easily monitored, Su Lu explained that Zhang Xiaoming was in charge of the intelligence work of Green Dragon Mountain. He frowned and said, "Green Dragon Mountain is increasingly marginalized. I'm worried that your committee will go crazy." "I saw the news." Zhang Xiaoming was silent for a long time on the other end of the phone. Maybe she pushed her black-rimmed glasses, or she gently pinched the devil horn hidden in the drawer. "At that time in school, I always felt that I carried a lot of secrets and a lot of pressure, so I had enough reasons to convince myself that some things were not the most important. Only now do I know that you, a quiet but optimistic auditing student, were actually also bearing such a huge amount of pressure. I was carrying it, so I could hurt you. You were carrying it, but I still hurt you." Zhang Xiaoming's voice was a little sad and a little muffled. "Everyone in the Federation who saw the news today will have their own thoughts, but I only saw you who needed warmth the most and ended up being cold to me. I'm a little regretful." Sula held the phone and was silent for a long time. His body was straight, as if he was standing right in front of her. Suddenly, he smiled and said gently, "Dear, we're still young. It's not too late to regret." Later in the night, Jian Shui sent a video message. The federal forces that had invaded the mainland of the Empire were carrying out battlefield rotation work. The Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division, the 2 units that had taken on the most important tasks in the first phase of the war, were ordered to return to the capital ring to rest and reorganize. Jian Shui, the Federal Fleet's Airborne Brigade, was also resting and reorganizing. The former national idol, now a beautiful female officer, was on the long journey home. Before today, only a few people in the Federation knew about Su Li's secret. The old man, Lady Tai, and of course Jian Shikar, as the uncle's biological daughter, was the one who knew the story the best. In the video message, Jian Shikar, whose beautiful face had 2 traces of oil stains, looked particularly attractive. She did not comfort Su Li. Instead, she joked about the rapid decline of his reputation with a calm and amused attitude. At the end of the message, she inconspicuously mentioned what would happen if she were in his shoes after watching the video. Su Li could not help but frown and laugh self-deprecatingly. Thinking about the chaos of the day, he realized that there was indeed something wrong with his response. Why was he still so angry when he was mentally prepared for this? Thinking about Jian Shikar, if one day the Federation's media suddenly exposed that she was the biological daughter of the traitor Yu Feng, and that half of her blood was from the Empire, what kind of terrifying situation would that be? After another half an hour, Li Xiaodong's call finally came. Su Li knew that under the current situation, this 7th young master would need to think about how long to think before he called him. However, since the phone rang and he heard the other party's comforting voice, Su Li felt good and warm. In the darkest moment of the night, he leaned against the sofa and pretended to be asleep. The phone in his right hand rang again. The voice of the man on the other end was soft and exceptionally peaceful. "Boss, I saw the news. I thought you would call even earlier." Su Li lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. "How can I have time to watch TV now? I only occasionally glance at it when I get up and change my diaper." Bai Yulan said softly on the other end of the phone. "This seems to be a bit troublesome. If there's anything, just say the word." He did not care whether Su Li was a fugitive, a murderer, a rapist, or any other criminal. He believed that the members of Group 7 would not care either. They only cared about how someone was causing trouble and how they should deal with it. Su Li's fingers, which were holding the cigarette, froze in midair. He recalled Lao Bai's parting words of the meadow in the Empire. Lao Bai had quit smoking in order to have children. It turned out that he already had children. That's right, as long as he spoke, that sissy would definitely throw the diapers against the wall and charge at him with a gun in both hands. "It's not troublesome. It's easy to deal with," he said with a smile. "I'll deal with it beautifully." That was a lie. The situation that Su Li was facing was already hopeless. There was an unknown danger in the bleak future. He did not know that more than 1,000 kilometers away in Philadelphia, there was an amazing old man who was telling him the truth and helping him deal with some things in a hoarse voice. Chief Editor Bob took a big puff of the white box 37 that was specially provided by the military. His eyes were a little red from the smoke. He was very clear that this so-called exclusive interview was, in fact, the last and most sacred record, so he recorded it very seriously. The small pencil with a retro and luxurious taste moved quickly on the plant fiber paper, recording the most vivid, and shocking history. Listening to the military god on the sickbed talk about his magnificent life with his own ears, he felt a lot of hot blood rush into his brain, but in the end, it was frozen into ice by the few simple words of the old man. The cigarette in Wood's mouth had burned to the filter, but he did not react at all. He looked at the old man on the bed in shock and said in panic, "I don't believe it. That traitor. How could he be your brother?" Bob took a big puff of the cigarette and choked on it. Chapter 700. After a long time, Chief Editor Bob finally managed to control his coughing. His face was red, and his fingers trembled slightly as he crushed the remaining half of the cigarette into the ashtray. He said hoarsely, "Marshal, if you insist on putting this story in, I refuse to publish it. At least, I refuse to publish it." The old man on the bed had reached the weakest period of his life. There should not be any smoke in the room, but Bob and Wood still could not hold back. They tore open the white box and began to smoke one cigarette after another, as if they were burning their spirit. The so-called final interview was for the old man on the bed to write a description of the military flag that covered the heavy black coffin. The two reporters could not bear the heavy burden of responsibility, especially after hearing this story. This kind of thing had political risks, but for Bob, he rarely thought about such things. Otherwise, he would not have made such a strong accusation against Senator Macklin. However, he had to consider his own feelings. His feelings did not allow him to write about the abnormally dark things in the old man's final interview. Lipifu half leaned against the headboard tiredly. The dark brown spots on his face did not have much luster, like plants that were severely dehydrated. It gave people the feeling that they would turn into dust and be blown away by the wind at any moment. However, the old man's face always had a calm smile. He had probably already seen through matters between life and death, and had seen through things that were beyond life and death. He looked at the two reporters and said gently with a smile, "The Special District Daily News is a newspaper that can barely be read in the Federation. You two are good reporters." Bob and would change their sitting positions at the same time. It was inevitable that they would feel proud to be praised by the war god, but it was also inevitable that they would feel nervous. Isn't the responsibility of a good reporter to write about the story? The old man laughed. His hoarse and hollow voice echoed in the quiet room, disturbing the smoke that filled the room. The most famous mechanic who committed treason in the Federation's 37th constitutional history. He is indeed my blood brother. Why can't I write this down? Bob leaned to the left of the chair and rested his chin on his two fingers. After a long silence, he suddenly said, "You insist on recording this matter that no one knows about. Is it because you want to share the burden of Colonel Sulu?" The old man's hand, which was as old as the dry roots of a tree, rested on the snow-white bedding quietly. He could barely feel the flow of life in his veins. The old man smiled and replied softly, "I've been given too much honor by the people of the Federation in my life, but I've been hiding many things from them. When I'm about to die, I always feel that I owe them something. Besides that, there's also the reason that you've guessed. A young man as good as Sulu shouldn't be burdened by the vulgar stories of the seniors. The Federation needs him. No, to be more precise, you will need him very much in the future. So, you're willing to pour dirty water on yourself to reduce the degree of distrust the entire Federation has for Colonel Sulu?" Bob raised the pencil in his right hand and looked at the old man on the bed seriously. Intense coughs burst out from the old body at the head of the bed, like a 1,000-year-old clock that was blown by the wind of time and hummed non-stop. The old man raised his arm with difficulty and wiped away the white foam on his lips. He continued, "I just want the Federation to understand one thing. The brother of a traitor is not necessarily a traitor. Then, as the student of a traitor, Sulu is naturally not a traitor. But if the people become even more furious and fanatical because of this story and even vent their anger on Colonel Sulu, won't your wish be realized? I believe that the people of the Federation will believe me," the old man said. Two simple words of believe represented the decades of history between him and this space zone that no one dared to doubt. Bob was stunned for a moment. Then, he nodded slightly and stared at the pencil in his hand for a long time. Then, he raised his head and said seriously, "I promise you that I will include every word of your story and your brother's story in the interview." "Thank you. Lord Marshal, regarding this interview, can you include some things that the people are very interested in?" Chief Editor Bob lit up another white box of Sanchi and put the small square notebook on his knees. He asked, "For example, your hobbies, your personality, your retirement life. When were you the happiest and the saddest in all these years?" You must know that for decades, the Federation's press has never dug up this part of the content. Tens of billions of people in East Forest, West Forest, and Upper Forest have been curious about it for their entire lives. Me? I'm a boring guy who has nothing to write about. The old man rubbed his chest and laughed hoarsely. And I have a very bad temper. Just like right now, when I see you smoking and remember that I haven't smoked a single cigarette in 10 years, I feel extremely angry. Chief Editor Bob smiled, but he did not give up the rare opportunity to ask a question from an excellent news follower who had turned into an admirer. He asked curiously, "What is the most profound memory of your life? Is it the moment when you drove an M37 and killed the emperor of the empire? Of course not. Lipifu narrowed his eyes and looked at the smoke floating in the air. He said, "That was just a battle, no different in essence from the countless battles I have participated in my life." The old man slowly lowered his head and looked at the two people who were constantly taking notes. His white eyebrows suddenly raised, and he said hoarsely, "The most profound memory of my life was in the Empire. When I held the baby in front of me, the wind just happened to disperse the smoke, and the sun came in and shone directly on the little girl's face. She was beautiful and weak, like a flower that had just opened its petals." "Then what was the happiest moment?" Bob looked at the old man curiously and continued to ask, "Was it the final victory of the Second World War, or the day you took off the marshal's uniform and officially retired? The Federation's marshal is a job that can't be happy at all." The old man rubbed his loose cheeks and said with deep regret, "I thought I would be happy when I retired, but in the end, I can't be happy. I just said that the medical team won't let you smoke, the security team won't let you mow the lawn, and the publicity team won't let you go to the casino. A retired marshal is still a marshal. It's not natural. Maybe in the future, I will be free forever." A self-deprecating smile appeared on the old face as the god of war Lipifu said in a low voice. It was like he was talking to himself, but it was also like some kind of hypnotic spell. Gradually, his eyes closed. The alarm sounded, and the glass wall on the side suddenly closed. The medical experts with serious expressions held the physiological data screen and rushed over at high speed. The senior military generals who reacted slower widened their eyes. The director of the Army General Hospital, who reacted the fastest, rushed to the bedside with a face full of horror. He subconsciously reached out his hand to touch the old man's neck. At this moment, the old and tired eyes suddenly opened. After a flash of light, it was full of calmness and faint mockery. The people who rushed into the ward were instantly stunned. The director of the Army General Hospital nervously scratched his head, looked at the normal lines on the surveillance equipment, and laughed foolishly. "Did you see that? Although the marshal, am about to die, I am still under their control." Lipifu looked at the two dumbfounded reporters and said with a smile, "They're the best at using all kinds of lies to deceive me. They clearly said that it was a one-way surveillance and that they were looking at me, but in the end, they have been watching me the entire time, and they have to pretend that they are not looking at me. It's really hard." Bob and Wood looked at each other, patted their chests, and stiffly sat back in their chairs. They felt that their mouths were dry, so they quickly took 2 big gulps of water. "Sir, if we don't do a comprehensive surveillance, how do we know if you were asleep or—" The director of the Army General Hospital was the medical officer of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Regiment of the 17th Division on the battlefield. He naturally saw that Lipifu was different from the others, so he shrugged and replied. His tone was not very nervous. "Bullshit," Lipifu sternly scolded, then turned his head to look at Bob. He raised his right hand, separated his index finger and middle finger, coughed twice, and pretended to be calm, and said, "Give me a cigarette." The rest of the medical staff returned to their positions. When Chief Editor Bob heard this request, he was stunned. He naturally looked at the big boss of the medical field of the Federation for help. The director looked at the calm face of the old man on the bed, mixed with a trace of pleading. He didn't know why, but he felt like his heart was being cut by a sharp knife. He didn't dare to look at him again. He swallowed his sigh, forced a smile, and walked out of the ward with half of his body. Wood quickly stood up and walked to the bedside as quickly as possible without making any noise. He took out a cigarette and carefully put it between the dry lips of the old man. Then he held a metal windproof lighter with both hands and lit it with a snap. Wood didn't know whether it was because he was so close to the old man or because of some other reason, but he was very nervous when he lit the cigarette. His fingers, wrist, and even his whole body were slightly trembling. Lipifu seriously took a puff of the cigarette. He frowned for a moment, as if he was trying to distinguish the difference between this puff of smoke and the smoke on the battlefield 10 years ago. In the end, the old man gave up and said with a smile, "Thank you." Then a light flashed in the old man's eyes. He said in a hoarse voice, "Cigarettes seem to really help humans think. I suddenly remember when I was happiest in my life. Bob listened carefully and took notes. It was in the Empire. That year, the transport ship was ambushed by the Empire's fleet. The 17th Division was forced to land on an Empire administrative planet. According to the intelligence, the two most powerful armored brigades of the Empire's royal family were stationed on the surface of the Northeast Star System. The guys who fought the yellow flag. I didn't know how many of my young men would die, so I was in a bad mood. But when I came in contact with them, I realized the 17th Division was really lucky. The old man on the bed narrowed his eyes. He was full of smiles, but he was also very sarcastic. There were no Imperial brigades on that planet. There were only 100,000 native troops stationed there. They were the famous 3rd Division of Lin who played in the mud in the Northeast Star System. What makes people happiest? Of course, it's when you thought you were in a desperate situation, but you realized that the heavens took pity on you and made you meet a bunch of idiots. Chapter 701. Teleporting from the snow-filled Capital Special District to Philadelphia, where there were hot springs, to conduct the last interview of the Federation's God of War. Even for people like Bob and Wood, who had personally witnessed countless major events in the Federation, it was very abrupt and shocking. And the interview also ended very suddenly. The weak old man on the bed finished smoking a cigarette, said thank you, and then said goodbye. The two of them were politely asked to leave the room. Standing in the shadow of the locust tree in the courtyard, looking up at the moon in the sky, and feeling the slightly cold wind blowing in their faces, Bob and Wood continued to be in a daze. Then, they lit up their cigarettes almost at the same time. They had smoked too many cigarettes tonight, so their mouths were full of bitterness. Two lieutenant colonels of the Ministry of National Defense's Publicity Department had been waiting in the courtyard and had a conversation with the two reporters. Then, the news director of the presidential residence, who had just arrived in Philadelphia on flight number 1, also came forward nervously, lowered his voice, and asked about the relevant situation. He also asked for a review in advance. Chief Editor Bob did not hesitate to reject the request of the news director of the presidential residence. With his current status in the Federation's news industry, plus his good personal relationship with President Pabre, and more importantly, he had to adhere to the professional code of conduct for half of his life, this kind of rejection was natural. Although I believe that the Federation's people's respect for the general will not be shaken by this interview. As the author, we are very likely to be glared at by the public. Wood took a deep drag on his cigarette and said in a deep voice, I'm more worried that the press will be thrown countless baskets of rotten fruit. The professional demonstrators of the Veterans Association are not easy to deal with. Don't worry about this. Call the secretary and ask him to check the night flight. We must rush this interview out tonight. Chief Editor Bob wanted to throw away the cigarette, but he found that the Lee family's courtyard was very clean and tidy. He couldn't find a suitable corner to destroy the cigarette, but he had to put it out with the tip of his shoe and pinched it between his fingers. Why are you in such a hurry? I think we should at least let the editorial board take a look, Wood asked in surprise. It's too late. Bob took a deep breath. He looked at the full moon hanging above the locust tree and the crescent moon on the dark blue horizon in the distance and said, The marshal doesn't have much time left. He wants to see this interview. No one knows how many more days the old man can wait, so we have to publish it in the shortest amount of time possible. Wood was silent for a long time. He shrugged with the cigarette in his mouth and said sadly, Once this interview is published, anyone with a bit of intelligence will be able to guess that something is going to happen, that the God of War is dying. I really don't know how the Federation will react. No matter what kind of reaction you have, it's not surprising. Bob subconsciously pinched the shriveled carbon filter and said emotionally, The Federation only has one army god. In addition to the president's official residence, the senior military officials, and Mrs. Macho, who knew the inside story, probably the elders of the major families also vaguely guessed that something big was happening in Philadelphia. But before any authoritative information was released, no one dared to talk about it, because the identity of the old man on the hospital bed was too special. Therefore, the big shots in the capital's special administrative region did not receive any news. Their attention was still focused on the war on the front line, the Westwood's lawsuit, and the news about Colonel Sulu that had just exploded. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation, the majestic Parliament Hill stood silently amidst the cold wind and snow. It was as warm as spring inside, the majestic building protected by dozens of gigantic circular stone pillars. It was blazing hot because of the heated debate and even insults. In a vote, just now, the government proposed an additional military budget proposal. Under extremely difficult circumstances, with the temporary defection of several members from the S2 industrial sector, it passed at a very low altitude. The difference in votes between the two sides was actually only 7 votes. Everyone in Parliament Hill understood why the budget proposal that had been the news for half a month was so difficult to pass when the federal forces were winning, President Pabre's popularity was rising, and the public support was constantly climbing. It was because there were many forces in the Federation's political circle. Because of the news about Colonel Sulu, they smelled something strange and began to consciously or unconsciously stand on the opposite side of the president's official residence in an attempt to gain some kind of political benefit. This is a conspiracy, a dirty conspiracy. This is a complete political conspiracy. Inside the magnificent Parliament Hill, the seats of the members were arranged in layers at a very high angle. It looked extremely oppressive. The semi-elliptical design of the seats made the densely packed seats of the members give off a sense of holiness like a space opera. In contrast, the 3-story rostrum in the middle looked a little humble. At this time, a female member of the Parliament, who was about 50 years old and wearing a light pink suit, was standing in front of the microphone on the rostrum. Waving her arms excitedly, she launched the most serious accusation to her colleagues in the hall. Behind her, Mr. Zion, the deputy chairman of the Management Committee of the Federation, and Mr. Byron, the statutory chairman and the vice president of the Federation, were calmly looking at her short hair that kept shaking. Evo's constituency was in Donglan. Just like President Pabre's background, she was the daughter of a miner. She had always been known as a radical and representative of the interests of the people at the bottom of the parliament. She coldly stared at the members of the parliament and said, Mr. President secretly authorized Colonel Sulu to investigate the attack on the antique bell. In less than a month, the Federation Bureau of Investigation accused Colonel Sulu of being a wanted criminal. Doesn't anyone feel that this is very strange? Wanted criminal? Why doesn't the Bureau of Proclamation have any data to prove it? Evo slammed the table heavily, pointed at the people, and said loudly, just based on those witnesses that you found from God knows where, you want to accuse a hero of the Federation as a criminal. What a ridiculous accusation. No one asked for the truth of the attack on the antique bell. Instead, you just poured dirty water on Colonel Sulu, who risked his life for the Federation. Where was Colonel Lake, who was involved in this case, sent to after he was arrested? Why didn't I get any response from the Ministry of Defense when I sent a letter? At the very least, even if Colonel Sulu is a wanted criminal, I would like to ask, what crime did he commit to make you so angry that you can't wait to shoot him? The female counselor spread her hands and said with emotion, I don't know how many deals are hidden in this hall. I only know that when we enter the Parliament Hill, we have to put our hands on the charter and swear. But obviously, many of us have forgotten this. I'm from Donglan. If Colonel Sulu is from Donglan, I'll only feel proud. That's all I have to say. There was an uproar in the Parliament Hill. Countless voices of objection and angry reprimands sounded from the high, cliff-like seats. A male counselor wearing gold-rimmed glasses rang the bell in front of him, frowned and said, Counselor Evo, I would like to ask you to pay attention to your manners. We insist on investigating Colonel Sulu, of course, based on the spirit of the Charter. Spirit of the Charter? Counselor Paulson, if my memory is correct, before you were elected as a counselor, you were the Deputy Minister of Finance of the previous government. And before that, you were Senior Director of Shungao Investment Company. Counselor Evo looked at him and said with a hint of mockery, Shungao Investment Company has been trying to persuade the government to divide the ancient clock company. Do you need me to say more clearly what kind of role you played in it, based on the spirit of the Charter? I highly doubt that when you put your hands on the charter, you were thinking about money. Slander. Counselor Paulson waved his arms angrily and said sternly, "No matter how you twist the truth, there is no way to clear the criminal's name." Colonel Su Lu entered the army by hiding his identity, hiding his relationship with the most wanted criminal of the Federation. Counselor Evo, with your Master of Law degree, you should know very well how many laws of the Federation he has violated. You must be responsible for what you said just now. Counselor Paulson looked back at his colleagues and said loudly, "Mr. President must also be responsible for this. Why did he allow Su Lu to be bailed out? Does he not know how much of a threat this person poses to the safety of the Federation?" He stared at the audience coldly and said, "Su Lu is the student of the most notorious traitor in the history of the Federation. Who can explain his real purpose of entering the capital ring incognito? Who can guarantee to the entire Federation that there is no conspiracy or ambition behind his actions? The student of a traitor is a traitor." Counselor Evo retorted loudly, "This is not the era of the former dynasty. There is no such thing as the conviction of bloodline. Everyone, wake up. Look at the war on the front line. What we need is unity and calmness, not fanatical moral persecution." Perhaps Counselor Evo's speech was clear-headed, but she forgot one thing. The more wartime it was, the more sensitive the so-called moral position was. Her speech was instantly drowned by the ridicule and reprimand. The entire hall of the Parliament kept echoing with the words such as treason, conspiracy, trial, and so on. At this time, many counselors suddenly noticed some changes in the corner of the hall. They saw many employees, many of them from their own offices, appear in the aisles with anxious faces and give them hints from a very long distance away. These hundreds of counselors who controlled the fate of the Federation were not necessarily the smartest people, but they were definitely the most sensitive people in politics. In other words, they were the most conservative group of people. After seeing the hints of the employees in the office, although they did not understand the real reason, the fierce attacks against Colonel Su Lu and President Pabre gradually became fewer and fewer. Then, all the counselors received the Capital Special District Daily that was published in advance today and saw 3 pages of the most serious newspaper in the Federation that a short half-hour adjournment. Counselor Evo stood on the rostrum and waved the newspaper in her hand with a serious face. She asked loudly, "Now, who still thinks that the student of a traitor must be a traitor?" Counselor Paulson sat down while panting heavily. The entire Parliament Hall was dead silent. Only Counselor Evo's loud voice could be heard. She kept waving the newspaper in her hand. On the newspaper, War Godly Pifu was smiling, but the counselors were terrified and had difficulty breathing. Chapter 702. Less than 10 minutes after the exclusive interview that took up 3 full pages of the Capital Special District Daily appeared, the reporters, cameras, and broadcast vans around the Wangdu Youth Apartment, as well as the 24-hour rooms in the opposite apartment building, were suddenly reduced by more than half. The reporters who were slow to realize what had happened immediately began to race to Philadelphia. That day, the flights from the Capital Special District to Philadelphia were all full, but there were still many people who did not get the precious tickets. Unfortunately, Philadelphia was not Wangdu, and the seriously ill military god was not the young Colonel Su Lu. Before the planes of several famous TV stations could enter the airspace of Philadelphia, they were ordered by the military to land at an unknown small airport 3,000 kilometers away. The reporters who had arrived at Philadelphia were also driven to the Old City by the armed special forces of the 1st Military Region, and all the long-distance high-definition video recording equipment were confiscated. This was a serious violation of the freedom of the press and human rights. But at this time, no TV station or newspaper dared to raise any angry protests against the Federation government. In the past, they could scold the president, the parliament, and all the officials in the world. But now, in the face of the scene before the death of a superstar, if anyone dared to open their mouth to question anything, they would be trampled into pieces of garbage by the angry people the next day. The outside of the youth apartment was no longer as noisy and annoying as it was 2 days ago. Sulu silently looked at the electronic news on the light screen. He stood up and thought for a moment while holding his forehead. Then he put on his military uniform and quietly climbed out of the back window. With the help of the Federal Central Computer, he easily avoided the prying eyes of the reporters and arrived at the military airport in the western suburbs before evening, boarding the special military plane that had been prepared by the Ministry of Defense. At 7:14 p.m., Sulu arrived in Philadelphia and went to the courtyard by the lake. Walking into the room overflowing with the smell of medicine and the electronic sound of sophisticated medical equipment, he quietly sat on the bed covered with white clouds and gently held the thin but still strong hand of the old man in the clouds. No one knew what Pifus said to him. People only knew that Sulu did not stay in Philadelphia for long, and once again returned to the Capital Special District. The dark green military vehicle drove directly into the West Mountain compound after him. It was already early in the morning. Deep in the courtyard of Shishan Mountain, Minister Zhou's house was shrouded in the light morning light. The remaining snow mixed with the withered leaves in front of the house, densely packed like the wrinkles of the earth. Mr. President was also in Philadelphia last night. I met with him before I left. In a study on the second floor, Sulu held the scalding orange tea that Zhou had just brought in with both hands. His thick eyebrows were furrowed tightly as he said softly, "Mr. President told me some things." He mentioned his sick daughter. He said, "Everyone has someone or something they care about, so at certain moments, they always need to make certain compromises and concessions. And these compromises and concessions often require more wisdom and courage than making great strides forward." He recalled for a moment and confirmed that he had not made a single mistake when he repeated the president's words. Director Zhou Yingxing sat on the sofa opposite him, deep in thought. After the big shots in the Capital Special District learned about the physical condition of Army Godly Pifu, they all went to Philadelphia to visit him. Regardless of whether these people could see the old man on the sickbed in the end, they had to go to show their attitude. But as the Minister of National Defense, he unexpectedly stayed. On one hand, it was because the war on the front line of the empire was still going on. On the other hand, it was also because of the way this scholarly general handled things. "How was the general's body?" Zhou Yingxing asked. "His condition is very bad. The organ failure is very serious." Sulu put down the orange tea, rubbed his hair, and said after a pause, "It is purely a problem of age and old illness. The Army General Hospital is extremely pessimistic. They think that the old man may leave at any time." Minister Zhou was silent for a moment and said, "I have been in the logistics base. Seriously speaking, I have not done anything under the direct command of the old man. But every soldier in the Federation will think that they are just an ordinary soldier under the command of the general. When I heard this news, I was in a very bad mood." Sulu rubbed his left hand from his forehead to the back of his head and said a few dirty words in annoyance. The content of the general's interview has caused a great shock in the society. Minister Zhou looked at him quietly and said, "In fact, the relationship between the general and the traitor, that is, your teacher, is not an absolute secret in the upper echelons of the military. After all, they have been fighting for many years. An old man like General Miles will more or less guess something. We originally thought that after the general passed away, no one would mention this matter again. Naturally, the Federation would not know about this matter in the future. Who would have thought that the general would arrange an interview himself and reveal this secret past? What does this mean?" Zhou Yingxing took off his glasses and rubbed his forehead tiredly. He said emotionally, "Everyone has to admit that Marshal Li is the only leader in the history of the Federation who has no flaws. When he left this world, he should have been perfect, but he did not accept this perfection." He raised his head and looked at Sulu quietly. "You should understand better than anyone why the general did this." "I understand. This is to protect me." Sulu lowered his head and stared at the dust on his military boots. "The old man's body is very weak. We did not talk for too long last night, but I understand what he meant." Sulu raised his head. His clean eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion and calmness after enlightenment. He said, "The old man knows that I have a flaw in my character. If I let things go on like this, I will be impulsive. The old man does not want me to become scavenger. That kind of character can only destroy, not build. It is of no real benefit to the Federation and the people. I am very gratified that you can understand the General's painstaking efforts. I believe that Mr. President also means the same. Zhou Yingxing slowly loosened his fingers from rubbing his forehead. He looked at him and said calmly, "Light and darkness are twins. No one can overturn this. Even if you suddenly kill people today and use your life as the price to sweep away the darkness before you, what about in the future? If you die, who will clean up the new darkness in the Federation in the future?" Minister Zhou looked at him and continued, "The general had the ability to clean up the government and even kill everyone, but he did not do so. If you have the chance, you can carefully read the general's record. For several decades, even he has been constantly making concessions and compromising. This is precisely for the sake of a firmer and steadier advance in the future. A man with a true sense of responsibility, a soldier, should learn to endure, watch, protect, and not sacrifice himself lightly. He disdains to die together with those disdainful juniors, because only in this way can he be considered to have given his entire life to the Federation and the people. The general has persevered like this all his life. I hope you can follow his example." Sulu was silent for a long time, and then nodded. "This is your latest appointment." Zhou Yingxing took out an electronic document that was clearly just drafted from the desk drawer and said, "Mr. President has already signed. You are appointed as a special representative of the government to head to the West Woods to preside over the strategic ordnance test of the General Assembly Base. At the same time, you have full authority to represent the government in negotiations with the representatives of the Empire's underground resistance organization." Sulu slowly raised his head, his eyes full of confusion. He could predict that he would be expelled from the political center of the Special Capital District, but he did not expect that he would be sent to the West Woods to carry out such a mission. After the exclusive interview in the Special Capital District Daily was published, the entire Federation fell into a kind of uneasiness and panic. This big article obviously had the nature of a monument to let everyone know that this meant that an old man may be leaving soon and that a certain era was coming to an end. The people of the Federation could not imagine what the Federation would do without the military god. Although in the past 10 years, the old man had already taken off the marshal's uniform and sat quietly by the Philadelphia lake to fish, as long as they knew that he was still alive, whether in the frontline troops or in Philadelphia, as long as they knew that he was still alive, as long as they knew that the old man was still alive, everyone was very relieved, whether in the frontline troops or in Philadelphia. Li Pifu, the military god who had once shocked the universe, once again shook the entire universe when he was about to leave. The news spread to Bermuda, and the pirates and tycoons were collectively speechless, not knowing how to react. When the news spread to the Empire, the Baijin royal family began to hold a carnival party, and the dark-eyed royals drank countless glasses of liquor. In short, everyone knew that the military god was about to die, and everyone was waiting for the arrival of that day with sadness, confusion, fear, calmness, or joy. However, to everyone's surprise, Li Pifu, who had been sentenced to death by the best doctors in the Federation, did not die, and was extremely valiant in coming back to life. Although they knew that this was only a temporary phenomenon, and that the military god's health had seriously deteriorated, and that he would not be able to hold on for too long, many people were still very emotional. The tenacious vitality and terrifying willpower contained in that old body seemed to have frightened the Grim Reaper, and he chose to temporarily leave. As long as the military god Li Pifu did not die, he would be the brightest star in the universe, forever shining on the Federation. He was the bright sun above S1, sinking into the horizon every night and stubbornly rising the next day to illuminate everything. Regardless of whether that sun would be extinguished the next day, the old man on the sickbed in Philadelphia expressed his attitude through an exclusive interview. The Federation Investigation Bureau immediately stopped the secret investigation of Sulu, and the district attorney's office sealed the relevant files. No more members of Parliament proposed to hold a special hearing on Parliament Hill. As for the accusation of treason, no one would mention it. The people who had the potential to control and influence the political structure of the entire Federation, or rather the entire Federation, were forced to make concessions to one person. They had to make concessions to the old man who was extremely weak, already on the verge of death, and could not even speak. The people only knew that the wind had stopped and the clouds had dispersed, and the entire Federation was peaceful and quiet, with a certain sense of commemoration and solemnity. However, they did not know that after this atmosphere, the Federation government, the various departments, and the fierce struggle that had taken place on Parliament Hill. The Bureau of Proclamation was silent, and the Department of National Defense stood behind Sulu, but it was not convenient for them to express their views. It was the same for the office of the president. That side stopped the accusation against Sulu, but it was impossible for them to allow him to continue his own investigation and access to those core secrets. One day in the late winter of the 71st year of the constitutional calendar, Sulu boarded a military spaceship headed for the Westwoods. Chapter 703. At the western suburbs military airport, a large snow remover spewed out foam-like chemicals. The tarmac that was covered in snow looked like an incredibly large laundry tub. The light warship that was preparing to head to Ceylon looked as comical and laughable as a piece of old-fashioned soap. Sulu stood below the warship and raised the collar of his military jacket to block the cold wind. Although the bone-piercing cold wind had no effect on his strong body, he didn't know why, but he always felt a chill from the inside out. It was because he knew very well that once he left, there would be no possibility of meeting the old man again. The next time he received news would probably be the day the old man passed away. In a sense, going to Ceylon today was to say goodbye to the old man forever. Because it involved the insider trading between the government and the judiciary, Sulu chose to leave quietly. There were no reporters or officials at the western suburbs military airport, only friends who specially came here. The Westwoods looks far away, but the warship will only need 10 days to reach it at full speed. Zoyu looked at him calmly and said, "It's good to go there to avoid the storm. Just treat it as a vacation." Nan Xiangmei stood beside Zoyu and looked at him with a smile. She didn't say anything. The troops that are on vacation will be back soon, including Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division and your division. Li Xiaotong lit a cigarette for Sulu and said in a low voice, "Thank God you are willing to leave. If you really continue to investigate, it will definitely be a repeat of the Macklin incident. As your investor, I am really worried that I will lose everything." Sulu smiled, thinking that his comrades in the 17th Division would be back soon, but he couldn't see them. He felt a little depressed. The so-called vacation was fake. Vice President Byron and the military radicals, as well as those family members who only cared about profits, just didn't want him to investigate the ancient bell again. In a sense, they seemed to have won a temporary victory. A vacation is a vacation. Don't think about anything else. Zoyu raised her finger and stared at him coldly. "You've been hiding it from us for so many years. Now we know that you're really a stinky rock from Donglin. But at least for now, you have to put away your temper." "Understood," Sulu replied calmly. Then he bowed and gently hugged Zoyu and Nan Xiangmei before shaking Li Xiaodong's hand tightly. Tai Ziyuan was preparing for next year's election, so he didn't come. However, when he looked around, he didn't see Shi Qinghai. His heart, that had just started to feel a little uneasy. He turned around and held Zhong Huiyan's soft little hand. The two of them walked up the gangway. Zhong Huiyan, who had been standing quietly beside him without saying a word, suddenly asked curiously, "You're going home just like that? How is that possible?" Sulu held her hand and suddenly found that the little girl seemed to have grown taller in just a few days. She was gradually developing into a delicate and pretty girl. He smiled and said, "It's never too late for a gentleman to take revenge. Brother, after you killed your way into the Empire, the Federation thought you were dead and made a documentary. In it, your subordinates said, you once said that you're used to taking revenge for small people from morning to night." Zhonglin opened her big innocent eyes and looked at him seriously and asked. Su Lu smiled and rubbed her soft black short hair. He didn't say anything. Zhong Huiyin smiled happily, leaned on his arm, and gently swayed her body. In the rumbling of the battleship, Su Lu took the little girl and started the journey back to the West Woods. Through the surveillance light screen, he looked at the capital's special district that was filled with white people. Thinking of the politicians in the buildings, he narrowed his eyes. Next year would be the election. He looked forward to President Pabre's successful re-election. General Li Jiedu's position as the chairman of the Federation's Joint Chiefs of Staff would be firmer. Together with Minister Zhou, they would suppress the radicals in the military and have an overall strategic advantage. At that time, he would return and use polite and reasonable or simple and violent methods to get the price and interest that they deserve from those people. The new year of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar passed by quietly. The thing that worried everyone didn't happen. The Federation, which had obtained victory, glory, and actual resources in the war, was full of songs and dances. The frontline troops started the first phase of rotation. The 8 ground troops that had taken on the harsh mission of entering the Empire's territory returned to the capital ring on warships. After a short rest at the Old Moon Base, the 7th Mechanic Division of the 3rd Military Region and the 17th Armor Division of the 1st Military Region landed on the surface amidst the cheers of the people. The Iron 7th Division didn't return to the original base of S3. This change made some military analysts feel strange, but it didn't cause any reaction within the government. This was because everyone knew that President Pabre had always trusted Division Shaoqing very much. Moreover, this was the capital ring under the protection of the glory of the Charter. No one would think in the direction of danger. No one knew how the new soldiers of the 17th Division reacted to the accusations that Su Lu had suffered. People only knew that Division Commander Yu Qinghai, who was known for his bad behavior, rushed to Philadelphia like a madman. He rushed to his teacher's sickbed as fast as he could. The next morning, Du Shaoqing also rushed to Philadelphia. In fact, all the military commanders in the first rotation didn't go home. Instead, they came directly to Philadelphia. The troops that retreated from the front line mainly belonged to the 1st Military Region and the 3rd Military Region. The second wave of troops that set off 2 months earlier naturally came from the 2nd Military Region and the 4th Military Region. No one knew whether it was because they were wary of the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain or some other reason, but most of the ground troops that were transferred to the front line were from the West Woods, including the special forces from Green Dragon Mountain. Anyone with a discerning eye could see that this was the Federation's way of disrupting the military structure of the West Woods military region and completely controlling the military power. However, now that the Zhong family in the West Woods was divided, there was no way to form a unified and strong voice to stop this trend. There were no more tigers in the West Woods. Under such circumstances, Colonel Su Lu, who was caught in the chaos, held the hand of the little princess of the Zhong family and returned to Sunset State in the West Woods. People in the East Woods were silent and tough like stones, but people in the West Woods had the most vivid and intense love and hate. They didn't care how many Federation laws Colonel Su Lu had violated. They only knew that it was Su Lu who avenged Commander Zhong and his wife and the young soldiers on the Antique Bell. They only knew that it was Su Lu who won the lawsuit for the old house and became the guardian of the little princess. Therefore, they welcomed Su Lu with the greatest enthusiasm. The representatives of the Empire's underground resistance were still on their way. The military equipment test at the General Assembly base was carried out in an orderly manner. Su Li's days in the West Woods were very relaxed and casual. Happy New Year! Happy New Year! It seemed that he was always happy. However, sometimes when he looked at the blue sky above his head, it was difficult for him not to think about the old man's health. Every time he thought that the old man would not be able to celebrate another new year, his mood began to become gloomy. Beside Philadelphia Lake, the old man, lying on the bed like a statue, slowly opened his eyes and squinted at the shadow in the corner of the room. After a moment of silence, he reached out and pressed a button. The transparent glass partition in the room suddenly turned black, and all the monitoring devices were cut off. You are finally willing to come home. The old man's voice was very weak and tired. He seemed to be extremely cold and sad. Chapter 704. The night outside the courtyard was dark, and the light in the room was dim. The electronic sound of medical equipment beeped like an old-fashioned clock, urging people to leave or return. There was no movement in the shadows in the corner of the room. Only the thick, dark green curtains swayed gently in the wind of the internal circulation ventilation system. No cat walked by, but it seemed like a cat did. There was a long period of silence, like a blank space suddenly appearing in the human mind. They didn't know the specific minutes and seconds, but they knew that it existed and was long. Then, a voice rang out from the shadows. "No, this is not my home. You forgot. Our home is behind a mountain, 4 kilometers away from the body cultivation center. There are no neon lights, no such big private lake, and no hundreds of stupid soldiers as bodyguards. This is only your home, the tomb of the living dead built for you by the Federation, the Cold Palace." Feng Yu's voice was as hoarse and indifferent as it had been many years ago. There was a sense of mockery and frivolity that was difficult to imitate. It sounded like a young hooligan who was riding a vintage motorcycle and screaming in the midst of young girls. But it also had the coolness of someone who sat cross-legged on the peak of Mount Yia and narrowed his eyes at the S1 cotton candy storm. Li Pifu quietly looked at the shadows in the corner of the hospital bed. His gaze was calm and weak, but for some reason, his voice had a lot of mockery. As the war god of the Federation, in his long life, it was probably only in front of this person that he could feel true equality, so he also had a kind of freedom. We haven't seen each other for decades, and this is probably the last time we see each other. I don't want to repeat those boring quarrels with you. The old man painfully frowned and waved his hand in annoyance. You chose to see me for the last time, but you're not here to argue with me about right and wrong again. Why not? The voice in the shadows rang out very quickly, with a hint of sharpness that made people's eardrums a little uncomfortable. You're going to die soon, so of course I have to take advantage of the time before you die to clarify these things. Otherwise, after you die, who can I find a reason with? Your son? Your grandson? Or that sissy president who smears black shoe polish on her face every day? By the way, old man, do you think that sissy president really thinks she can look more manly by smearing her face black? Or is he really addicted to pretending to be a minor? Although he could not see the expression of the person in the shadow of the corner, he could imagine how relaxed and mocking his features must have been when he said those words. I don't want to talk about these boring things with you. The old man on the hospital bed resolutely stopped the conversation from developing in this direction, although his arms were trembling violently. I started fighting when I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't want to fight when I'm 70 or 80 years old. I'm about to die. I want to keep the right to not listen to your nonsense. If you insist on continuing to fight, then I might as well die. Don't try to scare me with death, and you don't have to play dead. I know you the best in this universe. Even if you only have one breath left, that breath of yours will definitely support you to jump out of bed and slap me again. Feng Yu sat calmly in the shadow. He could not see the outline of his body at all. He could only vaguely capture a certain existence through the light of the stars outside the window and the voice. When Li Pifu calmly said that he was about to die, his sitting posture leaned forward slightly, and then it turned into mockery in the end. I have to admit, when it comes to fighting, no one in the universe is your opponent. I'm not either, so I have to keep a sufficient distance from you. Otherwise, if you really jump out of bed and kill me with one slap, you will die with me because you used up your last breath. Brother dying on the same day. This kind of ending is too melodramatic. I don't want to accept it. With a snap, a lighter was ignited, illuminating the corner of the wall. The dark green curtains seemed to have become bullets bound by blue flames under the warm light of the fire. The face under the hat, which was still young despite the vicissitudes of life, disappeared in a flash, leaving only the cigarette but flickering in the darkness. Actually, I've been thinking, if you really came to see me for the last time, should I set up a trap to catch you, or kill you. This might be the last chance. After I die, there probably won't be anyone who can deal with you." Li Pifu's withered hands gently stroked the white bedding, his hoarse and tired voice echoing in his shriveled chest. After pausing for a moment, he smiled with difficulty and continued in a low voice, "But I didn't do that because, even if I had a plan, I couldn't be sure if the troops could catch or kill you. More importantly, I've done enough for the Federation in my life, and I should be qualified to live the life of an ordinary person in the last bit of time I have left." The old man looked at the motionless red light in the dark corner and said calmly, "With my last breath, I don't want to fight with you. I just want to talk to you. Old man, you're still so narcissistic. In fact, you've been alive for several decades, but you couldn't kill me. As for the universe after you die, it's actually much more interesting than you think. Your grandson, Huai Fuchai, that ridiculously strong girl, and Sulu might be able to deal with me. The problem is, other than a stubborn old man like you, who would think about dealing with their own brother every day." The man in the shadows stiffened and then took a deep drag of the cigarette. His voice was light and mocking, filling the room with the smoke. Then he bent the middle finger of his right hand, pinched the lower end of the filter of the cigarette with his thumb, and flicked the burning cigarette toward Li Bofu, who was lying on the hospital bed, just like the missile that flew through the air at high speed on that imperial planet. The whole universe thought that the dying old man on the sickbed was on his last breath and couldn't move. The cigarette should fall directly on his face and splash out humiliating sparks. But the reality was not so. The weak and exhausted old man on his last breath raised his right arm with difficulty, separated two fingers, and pinched the cigarette with incomparable accuracy. Then he brought it to his lips and took a puff. His old face, full of scars and loose skin, showed an expression of extreme enjoyment. Their cooperation was very skillful. Probably several decades ago, at the beginning of the 37th constitutional era, or even the last few years of the last constitutional era, the two brothers greedily shared the cigarettes of their elders behind Mount Feiqing. As for the younger generation, I have to admit that you're better than me in terms of education. I'm not good at teaching people. I only know how to use facts to lead people. So in the process of teaching Li Feng, I only used bloody psychological means and unhealthy medical means to stimulate the development of his meridians. A few years ago, when I first saw Su Lu, this little guy, I found that you've already led him to a farther place. Like I said, you don't need to be modest about things like fighting, because it will appear very hypocritical. This situation can only prove that your luck is too bad. The man in the shadow lit another cigarette, still only showing his face in a glimpse. He said, "Blood inheritance has never been a stable thing. It's normal for the Li family generation to get worse and worse. When I was young, my teacher said that some people are born to practice these things. Sulu is like that, and so is that girl in the Empire who looks like a man." He stared at his elder brother on the bed from the shadow. After a long silence, he suddenly said, "In fact, the 10 postures I taught Sulu, in addition to stimulating Jinqi, were mainly to restrain the Feiqing cultivation school, which is to deal with you and your filial son and grandson." Li Pifu's old and weak face did not show the slightest surprise. He said in a hoarse and mocking voice, "A few years ago, when I first learned of your existence, I knew that you were scheming again. George Carlin, Professor Jean, Mechanic Yu Feng, you seem to have been scheming all your life. But the funny thing is, it seems that none of your schemes can be maintained until the day they succeed. You always abandon them halfway. Sulu seems to be the same. I like to play schemes." The voice in the shadow became sharp. He said mockingly, "You're an old guy who retired from the army for more than 10 years. You threw the martial uniform in the closet to mold. You're so carefree and indifferent to fame and fortune. But you definitely won't forget to let your conservative son control the army before you die, to wait for my stupid student Su Lu to gradually grow up and to throw Du Shaoqing to the front line of fight. You've already arranged everything." "Yes, this is my arrangement." Li Pifu gently pinched the cigarette and said calmly in a low voice, "What about you? What's your arrangement?" "There's no arrangement." Feng Yu waved the cigarette, but in the shadow, and said disdainfully, "Green Dragon Mountain? Student? These things are not fun. I've been wanting to play with them for a long time. Li Pifu shook his head with difficulty and said with emotion, when I think of your life, even I can't help but feel shocked. To be honest, sometimes when I think that it's my younger brother who has caused so much trouble in the Federation, I actually feel a faint sense of pride that I can't say out loud. Although it's rare that you've surprised me, I still have to finish what I want to say. Feng Yu in the shadow looked at his elder brother on the bed and said indifferently, I'm not a schemer. You're the biggest schemer in the universe. Are you going to continue arguing? Li Pifu coughed twice in discomfort and stared angrily and gloomily at the dark corner. Are you going to deny that you didn't have any schemes behind raising Sulu? Of course not. Feng Yu said, he's just an obedient and cute little dog. He can watch the house and play for fun, so I took him home and raised him. As for discovering that he was an extremely talented little dog, that was something that happened later. Don't try to explain anything or hide anything. Li Pifu looked coldly at the dark corner and said, perhaps this proves that you also have some sort of guilty conscience. Guilty conscience? That man was enraged. Waving his arms in agitation, he said, I taught him how to repair mecha, taught him how to make mecha, taught him how to use mecha, taught him how to fight, taught him how to kill cows, taught him how to eat cows, taught him how to enjoy life. What do I have to feel guilty about? Old man, if you really feel that there's a scheme behind this, with your personality, wouldn't you investigate? There's no need to investigate. Li Pifu said mockingly and disdainfully, I also know there's a scheme. There's no scheme. There's a scheme. No, there is. In the quiet room in the middle of the night, intense and childish arguments sounded like children arguing. Li Pifu and Feng Yu were, without a doubt, the most incredible pair of brothers in the 37th century. No, it should be said that they were the most incredible pair of brothers in history. They stood arrogantly in the stars between the Federation and the Empire and influenced the world we lived in for decades. They influenced history, changed history, and even became history themselves. They seemed to be very different in age, but in reality, they were already old and had the dust of history. Just like that, this pair of brothers, tonight at the shore of Philadelphia Lake on the hospital bed in the shadows, they were like children angrily accusing each other and arguing. They could admit defeat, but they were determined not to admit their mistakes. Chapter 705. What followed was silence. Then, Feng Yu questioned in a deep voice filled with grief and anger. Do you see that? Only a conspiracy theorist like you would think that everything in the world is a conspiracy. Why do you look so mature since you were young? How can you not be mature when you have too many thoughts? I'm different. Everyone in the universe wants to destroy me, but I'm not worried at all. I don't feel that all the canine mammals in the universe have wronged me. Of course, I haven't wronged them either. This is just a development that didn't happen together. Is it related to a conspiracy? According to what you said, our birth must be a conspiracy too. Our parents had to give birth to me after giving birth to you. They must have had the evil idea of using the great me to balance the great you. Otherwise, this matter doesn't make much sense from a probability perspective. Li Pifu, who was lying on the bed, was provoked by these sarcastic but still calm words. With a gloomy face, he gripped the soft quilt tightly and suddenly said, You don't have to say anything more. If Sulu is a gamble, I've already entered the game, and I will win in the end. After this somewhat obscure and unpredictable sentence came out, the room suddenly fell into a strange silence. The uncle in the shadows stared at his elder brother on the bed. One could vaguely see the bright eyes of an eagle shining in the darkness. After a long silence, he said with a slightly hoarse voice, If you insist that this is a gamble or a conspiracy, why do you think you will win? Why? Li Pifu's sparse white hair scattered on the pillow. The old man quietly looked at the ceiling above his head. A trace of a smile appeared on his drooping lips. He said indifferently, Because my eyes have seen a lot of things, such as what happened to you years ago. He slowly moved his body and looked at the darkness in the corner. He asked, You are a member of the Federation. Why are you helping the Imperium? Because I like it. The voice in the darkness was somewhat mocking, somewhat emotional, and somewhat cold. You know that I don't have any good feelings for this fucking Federation, especially after you stomped my teacher into a meat patty. When he said the last sentence, Feng Yu's voice suddenly became emotionless. It was as if a bowl of extremely sour and spicy Huainan soup had suddenly been turned into clear water by some kind of magic. It was a clear water without any taste or impurities. But this is our hometown, after all. There are people who care about you and love you here. For example, when Shaoli died, you didn't even look at him. So I'm cold and heartless. Feng Yu's voice was lively again. It floated out of the shadow and was as ear-piercing as needles. What about the Federation that you protect? The little tiger in the West Woods was murdered by the government and the army, but the crime was thrown to the people of the Imperium. The people of the Federation were as excited as if they had taken an aphrodisiac. They roared and fought back. You were a short-sleeved tight singlet with 2 moons on it. You really think you are a messenger of justice? What have you done about this matter? No, you didn't do anything. You just watched coldly. Oh, have you forgotten your identity? You are the god of war of the Federation. You are the real messenger of justice. For these 2 words, you didn't hesitate to hunt down your own brother. Then what about now? Why didn't you do anything when you knew that those people committed murder? And why didn't you let Sulu do anything either? The sharp and merciless questioning was like an alloy knife hidden in the mechanical arm of a mecha. It popped out with a whoosh, easily tearing through the air in the room, bringing with it a suffocating smell as it arrived in front of Li Bufu. This military god, who was revered by the entire Federation, narrowed his eyes. His weak gaze sharpened once again, as if he wanted to break through the long night sky. Because you think that this matter, or rather this conspiracy, is beneficial to the Federation, and because you subconsciously always thought that the entire Federation forces were your soldiers. Of course, the mastermind of this conspiracy is also your soldiers. On the contrary, it is precisely those disobedient troops in the West Woods who can't really be counted as your soldiers. If that's the case, why are you willing to continue investigating? Feng Yu's cold words were filled with a sinister delight. To be able to tear apart the most dazzling military uniform of the Federation's god of war was undoubtedly very interesting and exciting for someone who had spent his life wandering the stars and fighting against the glory of the Charter. Similarly, you also don't want Sulu to continue investigating, because if he does, your troops may suffer great losses. Sulu may also be in danger. In your eyes, that stupid little fellow is probably the Federation's best heavy weapon in the future. Now that he is being wasted in internal strife, it's too much of a waste. That's not what I think. On the bed, Li Pifu was silent for a moment. After coughing for a while, he looked at the darkness and explained very seriously, "But I don't want to explain anything." Then the old man sighed softly. He was extremely tired, but also extremely relaxed. He felt the touch of the soft mattress on his back and began to miss it. With a trace of complicated emotions, he looked up and said, "There's one more thing. I've always wanted to get a real answer from you." In the darkness of the corner, there was a moment of silence. The lighter was lit again. This time, it was a thick stick of tobacco. Feng Yu's forehead, which was half lowered, was incomparably bright under the light. He said in a hoarse voice, "Ask away. Why did you do that big explosion in the strategic material base?" Li Pifu turned his head and looked at the darkness. His brows were tightly furrowed. This question had troubled him for many years. All he wanted to do was to find out the reason. After all, the other party was his own younger brother. At that time, the purge in the Western Hemisphere was about to end. Although the battle in the Eastern Hemisphere was intense, the scope was limited. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to start transferring supplies in advance. Under those circumstances, who could have stopped you from taking Muzi away? Why did you detonate the material base? Moreover, you used a cluster of full-frequency electron beam explosives. You knew that the crystal mines that Macho had prepared for 10 years were all down there. How many people would have died from such an explosion? As he spoke and asked, Li Bofu finally became agitated. He stared at the darkness. His old eyes were as sharp as a knife, and the flames of anger were burning in them. After a long silence, Feng Yu's voice slowly pulled open the curtain of the night. When it fell into Li Pifu's ears, it was so calm and firm. At that time, the charter computer had already discovered me. It was too ruthless in its pursuit. I wanted to live, so I had to cut off all the tentacles that the charter had extended into the empire. I needed that big explosion. Li Pifu looked at the dark corner. His old eyes were slightly gloomy. After 20 years, he heard his younger brother admit that the big explosion was not forced. There was no conspiracy by the empire. There was no misjudgment or small probability. It was just an action that he had made after a calm judgment. The old man was still disappointed and sad. In order to live, you didn't hesitate to cause a big explosion. Of course, I know that you don't care if the Federation could defeat the Empire. But you don't even care that 100,000 Federation soldiers died because of you. You didn't even think that they could be considered your comrades. The old man's voice was indifferent and heavy. Everyone has their own world. If I die, this world will be gone. My life is naturally more important than 100,000 people. No, it's more important than 1 billion people. In the dark corner, Feng Yu sucked on a thick piece of tobacco and said coldly, "As for comrades, the Federation war god killed the teacher who loved me the most, and the federal forces flattened the house of my beloved woman. Do you think I can still consider myself a soldier of the Federation? There's no need to explain. You just need to live on," Li Pifu said mockingly. After a moment of silence, Feng Yu said, "If I had died at that time, what would have happened to the newborn Muzi?" Li Pifu narrowed his eyes. After a long silence, he squeezed out a barely audible sigh from his dry lips and said in a hoarse and low voice, "Yes, what should I have done? But I still think that what you did was wrong, a crime, and unforgivable. My epitaph in the future will be, 'I will not forgive any of you, so you don't have to forgive me.'" It could be vaguely seen that Feng Yu slowly stood up in the dark. "Also, at the moment when my newborn daughter is facing death, I will only act according to instinct. I won't think about what to do in pain like you. Old man, like I said, this is why you grow old so quickly. All right, it's getting late. I also have a question that has been in my heart for a long time that I want to ask you." Feng Yu slowly walked out from the shadows and then stood about 5 meters away from the large bed. That head of wild hair formed a distinct silhouette in the night. He leaned forward slightly and asked in a low voice, "All these years, have you ever thought of teacher at night? When you think of teacher who died under the foot of the Mecha, have you ever felt guilt or regret? If you could do it all over again, would you give up that last Mecha control move?" Li Pifu was expressionless. His white eyebrows were as straight as his back when he was young. He didn't think for too long and replied in a low voice, "No, and I haven't regretted it all these years. You and I both know very well that he is a master of the Empire. That vicious seed plan came from his genius brain. At the beginning of the war, he could quietly cross the galaxy to the Federation and secretly set up so many backup plans. Facing such a far-sighted master of the Empire, if he were to survive, I don't know what kind of terrible situation the Federation would face." Oh. Feng Yu ridiculed exaggeratedly. "You still insist that he came to Philadelphia to teach us a conspiracy. Old man, I really want to advise you. If you can survive, it's best to travel and feel the intentions of the executor. Of course, it's a pity that you don't seem to be able to survive." Li Pifu looked at him calmly, just like the argument a few decades ago. "In the end, you still can't explain why. Teacher came up with this seed plan. If he is really like what you said, he is just a peace-loving traveler. After a few decades, I already have the answer, but I don't know if you are willing to believe it." Feng Yu slowly walked a few steps to the bedside and said calmly, "In my opinion, Teacher's seed plan at the beginning was an effort to gradually integrate the Empire and the Federation." Li Pifu frowned. How can a member of the royal family of the Imperium, who was raised by the people of the Federation, be willing to wage a war against the Federation? What better person to promote peace between the two sides of the universe, or even to slowly learn from each other until the integration countless years later? Medellin. That's because the war had already begun. When Teacher started the seed plan, the war had not yet begun. After a long silence, Li Pifu said tiredly, "This is just your reasoning. It doesn't prove anything." In Schiller's Octavo, there is a saying, "Those who are not of my race are bound to have different hearts." Back then, the people of the Federation did not know the meaning of this saying until the people of the Empire appeared on the other side of the Night Scorpion Nebula. Teacher is, after all, an outsider. There is no reason for him to invest such long-term love for the Federation, at least not more than the Empire. This is the biggest problem. You also sat on that spaceship. Why do you still stubbornly believe that Teacher and his Hua family are really people of the Empire? Feng Yu looked at his elder brother at the bedside quietly. There was no mockery or disdain on his slightly weathered face. He was abnormally calm and said, "In this life, you always think too much. That's why you grow old too quickly. You have repeated it many times." Li Pifu coughed violently, then looked at his younger brother who was close by and said expressionlessly, "I do grow old quickly, so I die quickly. Are you satisfied now?" Feng Yu was silent and did not answer the question. Instead, he said, "Thank you for taking care of my daughter. I think that she is my daughter." Feng Yu stretched out his right hand somewhat awkwardly and patted the old man's shoulder, saying, "Okay, I won't argue with someone who is about to die. You're welcome." Li Pifu closed his eyes tiredly. "Have a safe journey." Feng Yu paused for a moment and then walked out of the door. "I won't see you out." The old man waved his hand with some disgust, as if he was shooing away a fly. Then he heard the sound of metal clanking, like wind chimes ringing in the quiet night of Philadelphia. Opening his eyes with difficulty and looking at the empty darkness, Li Bofu curled his loose lips and simply smiled. He thought to himself that this kid still had a habit of hanging a bunch of metal tools on his butt. It turned out that when they hit each other, they would still make such a clear sound. It was really like a death knell that hastened his death. When a most advanced medical team of the Federation found that all the monitoring equipment had failed, they rushed to the ward in a panic. When they turned on the lights and tried to find the real cause, it was almost dawn. No one knew that this pair of legendary brothers had already met in the middle of the night. Naturally, no one could imagine that with Feng Yu's ability and the deliberate cooperation of the god of war Li Pifu, it was so easy to temporarily prevent the outside world from spying on them. But looking at the god of war at the head of the bed whose jaw was gradually turning yellow, and looking at the heart-wrenching curve change on the medical data capture device, everyone knew that the old man was about to die. General Li Jiedu had been staying in Philadelphia for the past few months. He didn't take up the position of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation. He didn't even step out of the manor. The first thing he did was to go to his father's bedside and tightly hold his father's old hand. Li Pifu opened his eyes with difficulty and looked at his son, who still had a calm expression. He released his last smile and held his son's hand tightly. The old man tightened his grip, and his breathing became more and more rapid. Then he let go and stopped. Chapter 706. In winter, the temperature in Philadelphia was never too low, especially at the foot of the mountain and by the lakeside. There was only a thin layer of snow on the rooftop. When the bright morning sun shone on the thin layer of snow, it made the snow look as if it was about to burn. The snow began to melt into tiny streams of water that trickled down the ancient eaves and dripped onto the wet ground. The tiny raindrops had been smashing for many years, but they had yet to leave a clear mark on the hard ground, just like the thin and calm old man in the room. He had been shining in the Federation for many years, but there was still no way for him to fundamentally change too many things that had happened in the past. The door of the body training center in his hometown, Philadelphia, was open as usual. Young boys were exhaling white mist and kicking the wooden puppets tied with fine grass, just like he used to do in the past. The water on the eaves was still dripping slowly. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the perpetually calm and dull movement of the hour hand that made one feel suffocated. It was the greedily drooling little boy who was holding a bunch of red candy as he stared at the rising red sun. It was the comforting sound of the electronic self-check in the cockpit of the M-37 Mecha, whose right mechanical leg had been tragically broken on the smoky battlefield, revealing a metal wire as thick as an arm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the sound of childhood friends shooting at each other with bamboo guns and then falling down exaggeratedly. A beautiful little girl wearing a white cotton-padded jacket played the role of a female emergency doctor. Tick-tock, tick-tock. If the ticking slowed down a little, it would become the electronic sound that the Federation soldiers were most familiar with, the only sound they could hear when they were lonely and bored in the healing pods. The ticking stopped. There was no longer any fluctuation of power on the light screen. It had become a straight line that stretched from left to right to the edge. There was no end to it, and it was always calm. On the other side of the glass wall, the specialists of the treatment group of the Army General Hospital and the generals of the Federation took off their headphones and instruments numbly and stared at the old man on the bed in a daze. Some of them could not believe their eyes and felt that what they were seeing was fake. General Miles stared with his red eyes and did not say a word. He allowed the tears to wash away his wrinkles and pupils. However, after a long time, the scene in front of him did not change at all. General Lee J-Do knelt beside the bed and tightly held his father's increasingly cold hand. There was no emotion in his eyes. He then lowered his head and pressed his burning forehead against his father's cold hand. He hid his face in the shadows and quickly said some words of unknown meaning. It seemed like he was saying goodbye, but also seemed like he was narrating. There were sounds of banging outside the door. Someone seemed to want to stop and explain something, but someone else didn't want to hear any explanation. He directly rushed in and opened the closed door. Then he saw the old man on the bed with his eyes closed and the middle-aged general kneeling beside the bed. General Li Feng, whose face was covered with dust, blinked his eyes. His akiji gradually faded away. Only a trace of heart-wrenching frustration and helplessness suddenly flashed across his calm and powerful eyes. A second later, this frustration and helplessness instantly disappeared. He took a deep breath and slowly walked to the front of the bed. Then he knelt down with a bang and knocked his hard head hard on the damn floor. He fell down like a mountain. For him, the departure of his grandfather was like the collapse of the highest mountain in his heart. And he will be back in 3 hours. General Li Feng put his head on the ground and trembled in pain. No one saw that his eyes and nose were uncontrollably erupting on his face. He said with a trembling voice, "I came back late too." General Lee J-Do slowly stood up and carefully tidied his military uniform. He quietly looked at the bed and raised his hand to give a military salute. Behind the glass wall, the general in the special door of the Army General Hospital slowly raised his right hand and gave the most noble military salute to the skinny old man on the bed. The death of the god of war Li Pifu not only meant the sudden collapse of the highest mountain in Colonel Li Feng's heart, but also for many people in the Federation. The major incident that happened in Philadelphia in the morning was still under strict news control. However, the Federal fleet on the other side of the distant planet had already received the news first. President Pabre silently looked at the white snow on the grass outside the Oval Office. He looked at the fat pigeons foraging in the snow. Sadness and heavy pressure appeared in his peaceful eyes. On the terrace, Lady Tai held a cup of coffee and listened to Butler Jin's report that the private jet to Philadelphia had been prepared. Looking at the picturesque landscape after the snow, sadness and longing were undisguised on her face. She and Li Pifu had known each other for many years. She had an inseparable friendship with his family. Most importantly, Li Pifu was the person she truly respected. Therefore, in the entire universe, only his passing could make her express the sadness in the deepest part of her heart. On the other side of the Night Scorpion Nebula, somewhere in the distant and unfamiliar left sky galaxy, the Supreme Commander of the Federal Fleet, Admiral Hong Yuliang, stared at herself in the mirror with red eyes. Naturally, she thought of the teacher who had a loud voice and liked to tell erotic jokes many years ago. He was completely different from the hero in the brochure. When the teacher saw her for the first time, he mercilessly laughed at her because her eyes were as red as a rabbit's. A rabbit, a white rabbit, a pair of white rabbits. Yes, that was what the teacher said at that time. That was what happened at that time. Hong Yuliang turned on the hot water switch and allowed the steam to cover the entire lens. It covered the haggard and sad face in the mirror, as well as the pair of red rabbit-like eyes. Then, in the hot steam, he began to cry bitterly. South of Silin's Sunset State, the Federation's Chongfeng military base tarmac. At the beginning of February, year 72 of the Federation's standard calendar, it was supposed to be the middle of winter, but this was only for S1 in the end. Wearing sunglasses, Su Lu was enjoying the sunlight sprinkling down from the azure sky above his head. He was enjoying the clear, warm smell coming from the dark green military uniform. He was so comfortable that he nearly fell asleep. The Federation's new space battleship with a triangular floating wing design glided over from the distance of the tarmac. In the air that was somewhat distorted by the strong sunlight, the Federation's military flag could be faintly seen. The space battleship continuously passed through 6 water gates formed by water pillars and slowly came to a stop. There was a grand welcome ceremony, lively military music, a newly decorated red carpet on the gangway, and beautiful girls holding flowers. Su Lu, who suddenly woke up, narrowed his eyes and looked at these scenes through his sunglasses. He thought that the Westwoods had made so many preparations. Even if the foreigners who came to negotiate were still vigilant, they would still be relatively happy. The hatch of the Federation's battleship opened, and a middle-aged man in a black leather jacket slowly walked out. He stood at the top of the gangway and waved to the black mass of welcoming people on the tarmac. From the frequency of his waving and his stiff posture, he was obviously very nervous. In fact, it was not only him and the members of the delegation behind him who were nervous. The Federation soldiers and civilians on the tarmac were also very nervous because everyone knew the historical significance of today's meeting. Many years ago, the Empire's diplomatic mission, which was as silent as a suicide squad, once visited the Federation. Many years after that, the humans on both sides of the Night Scorpion Nebula never had direct contact again. Until today, another group of brave or stupid Empire people came to the Federation's land with negotiation terms instead of ammunition. The extremely insulting word stupid was naturally not an evaluation made by a conscientious young historian like me. Stupid. The commander of the West Woods Military Region's 2nd Rapid Response Brigade stood beside Su Lu. He looked at the stiff Empire person on the gangway, took off his sunglasses, and calmly mocked. He actually came in leather. Later, I'll get HDD Bureau to give him some trouble. Calmness and mockery usually could not be used together, but this young brigade commander behaved very naturally. That was because calling the people of the Imperium idiots was very natural for the soldiers of the Federation. It was even close to the truth, so he could be very calm. Su Lu shrugged and walked toward the gangway. He did not try to dispel this atmosphere. Although he knew that this kind of hostile atmosphere was not good for formal negotiations, he also knew that the blood feud of decades could not be suppressed by a few words. Presiding over the cooperation negotiations with the Empire's underground resistance organization was the latest mission that Mr. President gave him. Of course, it was also the best excuse for the radicals of the government to expel him from the capital ring. After all, this matter was connected by him in the Empire in the first place. Su Lu, who was walking towards the gangway under the light of the sun, was feeling very calm. He had a lot of contact with the members of the underground resistance organization who had come all the way from the Empire. He knew that they were not much different from ordinary people of the Federation, so he naturally did not find them troublesome. He was just worried that there would be trouble in Philadelphia and Qinghai. He did not know if the uncle would go to see the old man for the last time, and whether the uncle's safety would be a problem. Also, Mr. Schur had started to appear and disappear mysteriously again recently. And every time he appeared mysteriously, it meant that something troublesome was going to happen. In a situation where there was no reply, Su Lu asked the old man to help him investigate Qinghai's whereabouts. He was very surprised to find that the guy used some unknown method to hide from the most critical scans of the glory of the Charter. Another problem was that Colonel Lake. The Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense arrested this person, and Mr. Tion said that he would not let him die easily. Now that the election was around the corner, everything had to be done for the sake of stability. This person was temporarily detained in a secret military prison, but the problem was that he actually did not commit suicide. Killing oneself was always a simple matter, especially for a well-trained special soldier like Colonel Lake. Therefore, for Su Lu, the fact that he did not commit suicide meant that it was not a simple matter. The other side was very confident, but why were they so confident? Colonel Su Lu, it seems that you're not very happy to see your old friend. On the red carpet at the bottom of the gangway, a middle-aged Empire man wearing a black leather jacket looked at Su Lu in front of him. He waved his arm in an exaggerated manner and complained, "Did you forget about us murderers and arsonists after returning to the Federation?" The government translator, standing in the middle of the crowd, was very nervous after hearing this. He did not know what words to use to accurately express the friendship of the Empire's revolutionary friend, but also not to let Colonel Su Lu hear the profanity. Su Lu stopped the translator's efforts, took off his sunglasses, and hugged the other side with a smile, saying, "Mu In, welcome to my hometown." Chapter 707. Because in the eyes of all the people of the Federation, especially the men of the Federation, especially the male soldiers of the Federation, all the people of the Empire, especially the men of the Empire, especially the men of the Empire who had a certain fighting strength, were stupid or useless beasts full of rustic flavor. Because of the similar reasons described in reverse, it was easy to imagine that the welcome ceremony on the tarmac of the Changfeng military base was actually hiding too many swords and the most complicated greetings with dirty words under the surface of jubilation and warmth. Although the men of the Empire who walked off the battleship were said to be from some underground resistance organization and had been fighting with the Empire's royal army for hundreds of years, they were still from the Empire. This reason was enough to make the Federation people on the tarmac feel disgusted from the bottom of their hearts. Even if they tried to hide it, their expressions and actions couldn't help but become stiff. "Don't fight, at least in front of the news reporters, don't fight," Su Lu said softly to the excited and bloodthirsty brigade commander beside him. He didn't have any expression on his face, and his tone wasn't very strong either. However, after the brigade commander was stunned for a moment, he immediately became more obedient. As the most loyal military officer of the Zhong family, he had to show absolute obedience to Su Lu because he was the guardian of his little princess. "We are not here to fight." Mr. Muin, the leader of the Empire's underworld from the Tianjing planet, smiled as he took the flowers from the beautiful little girl. He wiped off the sweat on his forehead uncomfortably and said to Su Lu in a low voice, "Also, I am not used to this kind of situation. I didn't expect you to learn the Federation language so well." Su Lu shrugged and said, "Since your organization chose you to be the negotiation representative, you have to learn to endure the necessary procedures, such as the welcome ceremony. My Federation language isn't as good as your Empire language. Speaking of which, I always thought that your aristocratic accent was too proper, like the nobles in the palace." Muin laughed and put his arm around Su Li's shoulder without any hesitation. He walked towards the red carpet and waved his arm in front of the reporter's passionate flashes. "I'm only good at running smuggling routes and casinos. The organization asked me to be the negotiator because I'm already registered in the Royal Intelligence Department, so I'm not afraid of being exposed. In addition, in order to show our sincerity, I originally planned to invite Comrade Chi Dabing over, but I was worried that the two of you would fight again." "Did Chi Dabing take over?" "The temporary representative meeting will be held in 3 months. Right now, he is learning and familiarizing himself with the work. Why would I wave my fist at the future leader of the underground resistance?" Su Lu said without much sincerity. Then, he looked at Muin's neck and said in a low voice, "If it's very hot, do you need to hold me so tightly?" Mr. Muin didn't seem to hear Su Li's words at all. He put on a sincere smile and hugged Su Li's shoulder tightly, showing his passion and his very good personal relationship with Colonel Su Lu to the reporters of the Federation. The photo area flashed again and again. Even the dazzling light in the blue sky above their heads dimmed under the contrast of the sun. Su Lu narrowed his eyes. Suddenly, a slightly bitter smile appeared on his lips. He said in a low voice, "I know what you're thinking, and I also know what you need. But there's something I have to tell you." "What is it?" Mr. Muin looked forward and forced himself to forget the underworld aura in his bones. He waved his arms at a uniform speed like a politician. "I've already lost my power." Sulu also looked forward and said with a smile, "Some very powerful people can destroy me at any time. And I came to the West Woods to see you because I was purged by the government." Muin's arm that was holding Su Lu stiffened. A moment later, he laughed out loud and patted Su Li's back. He said in a deep voice, "It's even better if you lose. Then we could just drink a few cups. I can hear the sound of your crying in your heart." Su Lu mocked. Mr. Muin shrugged gently and said with a smile, "Leader Wise thinks highly of you, and so do I. You'll get back on your feet. Besides, according to the information from Bermuda, the organization confirmed that you're the successor of Army Godly Pifu. We don't have to worry about anything. It seems that you definitely didn't receive the latest information." "What?" "Army God is seriously ill. This is really shocking news." Muin frowned and looked at him. "Then why are you still here?" The beautiful sunlight shone through the sparse big leaf maples. The edges of this Ceylon's special big leaf maple were sharp, so even though the leaves were sparse, they were still able to cut the sunlight into countless oddly shaped shadows. The flickering spots between the shadows covered the grassy slopes and the woodland behind the base. Sulu lay on the grass and squinted at the magical light spots in the blue sky. He fell into a long silence. The orderlies in the distance looked at him with confusion. They probably didn't understand why the plenipotentiary of the government didn't care about the members of the resistance group after throwing them into the hotel. Instead, he snuck to the back of the base and stared blankly. What was more important than negotiation? Was staring blankly into space a happy thing? Obviously, Sula didn't think so, because he was very sad at the moment. Maybe it was because the light spots burned his retina or something else, but there were traces of sparkling water in his squinted eyes, and a trace of it slid down the corner of his right eye. On the red carpet of the welcome ceremony, in the cheerful military music, and under the excited photo-taking of the reporters, a line of white symbols appeared in Su Li's left pupil. In the friendly memorandum with the Federal Central Computer, there was a rule that forbade the old thing from entering his brain without permission. But today's matter was a special condition that he had agreed on in advance. The line of silent symbols read, Citizen Number, SLA 321-8971. Lipifu, Information Node Interrupted, announced death. When he saw the line of words in his left eye, the sun was shining brightly and the sound of gongs and drums filled the sky. However, he felt extremely cold, and the muscles on his back subconsciously tightened. Except for the people saluting in the room in Philadelphia, Su Lu should be the first person in the entire universe to know this news. He couldn't tell anyone else, and he couldn't reveal his true feelings, so he silently left the hotel on the base and went to the grassland under the maple forest to stare blankly into space. This feeling was a little strange. He had learned of a major event that would definitely shake the universe, but he had no way of telling others about his shock and sorrow. This was Shilin's Sunset Province, and the people of Shilin respected him. However, they were not his people like Group 7, so he had no one to talk to. This was probably the so-called frustration and helplessness. He picked up the military encrypted phone and dialed a number. After waiting for a long time, Su Lu was surprised to find that the call was connected. The voice on the other side of the phone was warm and charming, and it was very chaotic. "Hey, sure too. I heard that you were assigned to the Westwoods. Why are you calling me?" Shi Qinghai, who was obviously drunk, shouted loudly on the other side of the phone. Then he heard a woman's exaggerated laughter. I've called you many times just to remind you not to investigate that matter yourself. Do you understand? This is a very serious warning. Also, you motherfucker. Sulu thought for a moment, but in the end he swallowed back the expletives and the intention to ask. Looking at the blue sky above his head that was divided into pieces, he said calmly with a smile, "How are you now?" "Very good." Shi Qinghai laughed and said, "Why are you so nervous? By the way, I feel that you're not in a good mood, and your voice is slippery. What happened?" "Nothing." Sulu sat up on the grass and struggled to pull out the crushed cigarette box from his trouser pocket. He took out a 37 brand cigarette and stared at the cigarette for a long time. When the cigarette finally fit between his fingers, he put it to his mouth and lit it with satisfaction. There was a long silence. Shi Qinghai on the other side of the phone didn't urge him, but waited patiently. Sulu blew out the spicy smoke from his lungs from his mouth and nose. After a short pause, he said slowly into the phone, "Someone died." On the other side of the phone was a nightclub with blurred lights and the smell of liquor and soft drugs. After hanging up the phone, Shi Qinghai was silent for a while. Then he picked up the glass of amber liquid and smiled charmingly at the woman with slightly square eyes. He said, "Is prison work always so boring? Are you interested in my work?" The woman looked at him curiously. Then she rubbed her hands uneasily and explained with a forced smile, "I always thought that no one would be interested in female prison guards. After all, we deal with vicious criminals every day. Life is really boring." One old-fashioned view. Shi Qinghai drank the liquor in the glass. "It seems that our era has never really changed." The woman took a sip of the liquor sadly and looked at him with concern. She said, "Don't drink too fast. You should drink this." Shi Qinghai gently turned the empty glass in his hand and said in a daze, "Because an era is over. I know that the frontline troops need the cooperation of these empire people, so I can make concessions in the arms supply. Attitude? My attitude is very good. The photos in the West Woods military observation published yesterday can prove it. The question now is not how to negotiate, but why do I have to stay to negotiate?" The Department of Defense arranged a special office for Sulu in the famous Golden Star Hotel in Sunset State. Outside the window was the beautiful Silver Beach. But today, when he looked at the blue sea and blue sky outside the window, he couldn't feel at ease. He couldn't help but feel angry when he thought about what those people did. "Mr. Minister, if the funeral is scheduled for next month, then I have no reason not to go back. You want me to stay in the Westwoods? I need an explanation. If I'm not satisfied with this explanation, I don't think anyone can stop me from going back to attend the funeral." Chapter 708. While Sulu angrily sought an explanation from the Secretary of Defense, Zhou Yingxing, over the delayed, encrypted military phone call, he knew very well that the person who deliberately distanced him from the Lees of Philadelphia and prevented him from attending the war god's funeral was not actually from the Department of Defense. He directly made a call to the president's official residence, and after a fierce argument with Director Breen, he was given the opportunity to speak directly with President Pabre. But this was still not enough, because although the president understood his feelings, he did not agree with directly falling out with the other side over the old man's funeral. The president understood him, so he comforted him. Sulu also understood him. The election was about to begin, and the official residence was now under great pressure. Once Mr. Pabre lost in the election, everything, including the things he had promised Sulu, could never be brought up again. In the end, the reason Sulu remained in the West Woods in the Sunset State and did not attend the war god's funeral was because of a video message from Philadelphia. In the message, General Lee Jae-do calmly described the old man's dying wish and reminded Sulu that the other side had too many reasons to prevent him from attending the funeral. For example, when the people saw him, they would think of the mechanic and that their father had a traitorous younger brother. Then, they would be enraged, and the officers, who were already easily agitated, would be even more agitated. In the past few years, the entire Federation and the military had deliberately pushed him to the position of the war god's successor. Now that the situation had changed, the other side naturally did not want him to attend the funeral because they did not want the people to think of the so-called inheritance. However, this was not what Sulu was concerned about. He just thought that, as a junior, he should at least send the old man off. But now, even the old man's own son, General Lee Jae-do, had expressed his opposition. If he insisted, this kind of insistence would become a little strange. When Sulu looked at the starry sky in the sunset state with a complicated and inexplicable smile and made the decision to give up on attending the funeral, it was already the end of February of the 72nd year of the constitutional calendar. Countless snowstorms strangely fell on the various planets of the Federation at this time, and at the same time, the news of the war godly Pifu's death was spread to thousands of families. Although the Federation people were already mentally prepared for the war god's passing, they could not help but mourn. The densely packed Federation square cried in unison, but one thing was very noteworthy. The Federation people's grief was so calm, probably because they firmly believed that although the war god was gone, the Federation would always be victorious. Almost all television stations adjusted their broadcast plans at the last minute. The Federation News Channel, on the other hand, pulled out a long-prepared, large-scale news documentary filmed by the Jinxing Documentary Film Factory of the Ministry of National Defense and directed by the famous director Bai Ziming. This documentary, called The Man from Philadelphia, had only been broadcast for 3 days, but it had attracted a new wave of attention and mourning activities. All the major television stations applied to broadcast it online, and the young students of Linhai State University lit candles and looked at the light screen above their heads, guarding the old heroic spirit in the snow. The Central Committee of the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army published a press release written by the leader of Nanshui. In the press release, the committee warmly praised Marshal Li Pifu's great achievements in resisting the invasion of the empire. They deeply remembered the noble character of Marshal Li Pifu and called on the workers and students of the 4 states, Planet S2, and even the 3 regions of the Federation to carry on the Marshal's will and to fight to create a more peaceful and beautiful future. People noticed that when the press release described the glorious history of the war godly Pifu, it was very important to point out that in his battle career, Marshal Li had never had any conflicts with the armed forces of the people of Planet S2, the Empire's L9 system, the adventurous planet that was regarded as a paradise by interstellar pirates and smugglers, had now become the most serious place in the universe. Every building and every window seemed to constantly reflect the gloomy faces and the dark military uniforms. 170,000 elite ground troops of the Empire were gathered here, and 3 medium-sized fleets were patrolling the space outside the system. What terrified the local residents the most was the ground troops, made up of close to 500 of the latest Wolf mecha models. This metal wolf-like troop moved silently and sternly through the city. It was an uninteresting sight, and it was an indescribable visual shock that made one feel numb all over. This metal-tied mecha troop belonged to the great and invincible Her Royal Highness Huai Chaoshi, who had just finished inspecting the supply line in space, was scrubbing her face that was full of dust while listening to the rapid military report made by the guards. Occasionally, she would issue a few orders in a calm tone. The Empire's elite troops that had endured for a long time had severely damaged the offensive of the Federal Army in the last counterattack. In order to intimidate the Federation and stabilize the situation, Huai Chaoshi didn't hesitate to personally enter the battle as the Princess of Zwitian Galaxy. She blasted the stupid commander of the 4th Army into charcoal dust that filled the sky. At the same time, she also dispersed the seemingly unstoppable tide of the Federation's attack. The Empire's great retreat ends here. In the past, you won and advanced because I allowed you to win and advance. Now, I won't allow you to take another step forward, so you won't be able to take another step forward. This was the strongest message that the Imperial armies and their commander-in-chief sent to the enemy of the Federation. In fact, if it weren't for the MX Independent Mecha Troop, led by Colonel Li Feng, arriving outside the L9 system's dimensional door in advance, the Empire's Wolf Fong Mecha Troop that had rushed out with the tide might have swallowed up the entire Fourth Army that had been left behind on the planet's surface. In this unprecedented form of mecha warfare, Huai Chaoshi and Li Feng, the two mecha prodigies who had made a name for themselves at a young age, began to blossom with unimaginable splendor. Although they had never met on the battlefield, both the Federation and the Empire knew that that day would eventually come. Huai Chaoshi felt a little hungry. After thinking for a while, she poured herself a glass of milk. She was very satisfied with the current situation. Throwing the X3 crystal mine to those greedy capitalists of the Federation had indeed reduced the pressure by a lot. Her father was right. If a pack of dogs discover a bone of meat to eat, they would definitely not attack humans again. Instead, they would attack each other to share the bone of meat. The guard suddenly noticed that a document at the bottom of the electronic folder was marked with 5 gold stars. He frowned, thinking that the Intelligence Bureau official must have made a mistake. The Federation forces hadn't attacked Tianjin, so what kind of intelligence would require 5 gold stars? What's wrong? Huai Chaoshi asked with a frown as she tore open a piece of coconut milk bread and prepared to have a simple lunch. Seeing the expression on her subordinate's face, she asked with a frown, "It shouldn't be anything important." The trusted guard shrugged and opened the document. Then, he turned into a statue and remained silent for a long time. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva with difficulty and looked at Huai Chaoshi before saying in a hoarse voice, "Dog thief Li Pifu is dead." Huai Chaoshi put down the bread in her hand in a daze. Although she had received news of Li Pifu's serious illness a few months ago, she still found it hard to believe when she suddenly heard that he was dead. That person invaded the Empire's territory like a demon, burned the Empire's stars, massacred the Empire's citizens, and even killed the Emperor and the great teacher. He was evil and invincible for his entire life, but in the end, he died just like that. Huai Chaoshi walked to the window and looked at the blood-red sunset. She narrowed her eyes as if there were flames burning in them. Everyone said that she was invincible. No, at least Su Lu had escaped from her hands. In this universe, only that person was truly invincible, and in the end, he had only lost to time once. Li Pifu, I haven't defeated you yet. How can you die? When the Emperor found out about this shocking news, he probably felt the same sorrow as his daughter. He silently thought, "Li Pifu, you old thief, I haven't killed you yet. How can you be dead?" At the time, the Emperor was roaring in rage because of the underground resistance organization joining hands with the Federal Army. After hearing about Li Pifu's death, he suddenly calmed down. He waved his hand and drove everyone out of the palace. He himself passed through the screen full of sunflowers and came to the railing of Star Caesar Hall, gazing at the high and untouchable ground. Then His Majesty the Emperor released his hand and threw the vine that was full of old blood stains down. The funeral will be officially held on the 10th of next month. In the old mansion in the West Woods Sunset Province, Fatty Tion leaned against the soft sofa and watched the news on the hologram as he spoke to the two fellows on the other side. "Did you see the news release from Green Dragon Mountain? I heard that it was personally written by the leader of Nanshui. I also heard that his body seems to be on the verge of death." Sulu held a large white towel in both hands and rubbed the restless little head inside. He said, "I also heard that when the Empire's newspaper reported the news of the Marshal's death, there was a sentence written in a certain corner." "What sentence?" "Li Pifu is dead." Fatty Tion sighed with emotion. On the news screen, there was not a single trace of snow left on Charter Square in the Capital Special District. It was completely clean. A dense crowd stood on the square and looked up in anticipation. In the open space opposite the famous Group of Five, an extremely tall statue had appeared at some unknown time. Accompanied by enthusiastic applause, the curtain outside the statue flowed down like water. The most famous sculptor of the Federation devoted himself to strengthening the retro bronze material. The Shell Motor Company's heavy metal die casting department was responsible for the construction. Charter Square finally had a statue after thousands of years. The statue was of a young Li Pifu. At the time, he was wearing a tattered Federation military uniform and standing in front of the half-open hatch of an M37 mecha. In front of the sharp weapon extended from the right mechanical arm of the mecha, he was pointing at the tattered and blackened Imperial Hibiscus Chinese flag. Everyone knew that the image chosen by the statue was referring to the assassination that changed the fate of the Federation. That tattered Imperial Hibiscus Chinese flag was naturally referring to the Emperor of the Empire who died at the hands of the war god. The sky was filled with fireworks and thunderous applause. Countless Federation citizens looked up at Li Pifu's statue with tears in their eyes. Fatty Tian looked at the news screen and spread out his hands. General Li Jiedu relayed the marshal's last words. In his last words, the marshal said very clearly that he rejected any form of commemoration. The proposal was unanimously approved by the Senate. Not to mention General Li Jiedu, even the dead old master couldn't change anything. He couldn't jump out of the coffin and shout, "I don't want a statue." Sulu smiled and shrugged. He continued to rub the restless head under the towel and said, "Actually, just like the group of five, the marshal didn't need a statue, but the statue was already built." Chapter 709. The citizens of Silin were relatively calm about the passing of the war godly Bofu. This was probably because they had seen far too many life and death separations after decades of bitter war against the Empire. Moreover, Silin had never lacked heroes in its history, especially 2 years ago when they had just sent away their own hero. That was why they expressed their condolences and showed the most sincere respect for the old man's passing. Life quickly returned to normal after that. In fact, no matter who lived or died, the universe would always develop as it had been. Even the people of the Capital Ring had to mainly focus on their work, study, or denounce the shameless monopolies on the internet. This was life. In the morning, Su Lu held little Watermelon's hand and walked into the school. Under the awe-inspiring gazes of the teachers and students, he smiled and said goodbye. The little girl turned back and smiled sweetly, her black hair and fluffy plaid skirt dancing a waltz. Su Lu did not leave. He found a few technical books on turbochargers in the school library and sat silently by the window behind the tall bookshelf. Using the bright sunlight outside the window, he carefully read the books, trying to grasp the old and slightly primitive mechanical principles as quickly as possible and how to match them with the cutting-edge quasi-quantum engine. The whole morning passed like this. When the bell rang, he looked at the sunlight outside the window, squinted his eyes, and stretched lazily. He then walked to the bottom of the teaching building and took little Watermelon from the young female teacher. He was a little embarrassed to ignore the young female teacher's admiring and shy eyes. He lowered his head and led the little girl through the sea of people in the school and found a very inconspicuous red oil restaurant to pass the time. Then in the afternoon, Su Lu threw himself behind the tall bookshelf in the library like a soft cotton pillow. Because the angle of sunlight had changed, he chose a window facing west and continued to read in silence. Occasionally, he would pick up the military water bottle and drink a few mouthfuls of water. When the bell rang again, he went to the bottom of the teaching building and experienced the shy and admiring eyes of the young female teacher again. Although this female teacher and many other young female teachers in the school had been looking at him like this for a few months, he was still embarrassed. So, he lowered his stubborn head that he usually found difficult to lower. He held the little girl's hand and broke through the sea of people in the school as if he was escaping. When they returned to the old mansion in Wei 2 district, Fatty Tian would sometimes wait in the dining room with a knife and fork, and sometimes he would disappear without a trace. It was said that he had gone to the 2nd Rapid Response Brigade to compete in drinking. Zhong Huiyan, on the other hand, would use her fastest speed to rush upstairs, take a shower, wash her hair, and change into beautiful household clothes. Su Lu, on the other hand, would take advantage of this time to cook a few home-cooked dishes in the kitchen and a large pot of rice. After Zhong Huiyan bit her lip and stubbornly expressed that she was only willing to eat the food he cooked. The responsibility of cooking in the old mansion fell on him. Su Li's appetite was still as exaggerated as always, so it took a long time for him to cook a big pot of rice. By this time, Zhong Huiyan would have already washed herself clean, held a large white towel, and skipped downstairs. She would quietly stand in front of him and then lower her head to hide in the white towel. Su Lu wiped the little girl's wet hair quickly, simply, and even a little rudely. The cigarette in his mouth would often leak some ash. At times like this, he would often narrow his eyes and recall the homework content and key points in the parent handbook. He would think about where to start the tutoring after dinner and whether he should not go too deep into it. It seemed a little too early for a sixth-grade student to come into contact with theoretical physics. School, waiting, lunch, waiting, dinner, tutoring, storytelling, and waiting for the little girl to fall asleep. This was Su Li's daily routine in the Westwood Sunset State. After being banished from the capital ring, the Federation government did not arrange any specific work for him. Naturally, the negotiations with the Empire's underground resistance were handled by professional negotiators. The military equipment test project in the armaments assembly base was also handled by the Ministry of Defense and the Shell Motor Company's technical department. All Su Li needed to do was to attend a few cocktail parties to strengthen friendship and appease the anger of Mr. Muin and the other Outlanders. Other than that, there was nothing else to do. Therefore, he began to silently act as a guardian. According to the life attitude he had cultivated over the years, he should do what he did well. He tried his best to play the role of a male babysitter. This kind of life seemed a little boring and monotonous, but Su Li could adapt to it very well. This was because in this kind of boring and monotonous life, there was the word peaceful life that he liked very much. Compared to the battlefield full of blood and smoke, the Vanity Fair full of conspiracies and violence, he felt that his current life was as gentle and happy as the clouds. Why does the wave content of electrons begin to collapse when we observe them? Zhong Huashan, who was wearing a pink nightgown, was curled up in a corner of the sofa. She gently bit the end of a digital pen and asked in confusion. The little girl was not yet 12 years old, but her youthful appearance was very clear. The pair of bare feet that were exposed outside the nightgown were even more adorable. Although I have to admit that your learning ability is very amazing, I still think that it's a little too early to explain quantum physics. Su Li looked at the report card that the school had sent to his phone. Looking at the full marks on it, a faint sense of pride spontaneously grew in the depths of his heart. He could not help but laugh out loud. After the death of Commander Zhong and his wife, this delicate little girl in front of him was a family member that he had to do his best to take care of. However, he did not expect that little watermelon would have such an extraordinary talent in learning. Before the age of 12, she had already finished all the high school courses. If you're interested in this, there's a popular science book called The History of Quantum Physics. You can take a look at it first. Zhong Huashan shrugged like an adult and said cutely, I've already finished reading that book, but I have to admit that there are many parts that I don't understand. Brother, everyone says that you're a genius, so you should be able to explain it more clearly. Theoretical physics has always been my weak point. Su Li also shrugged and said, when I was learning from Professor Shen at the Research Institute, I was often criticized mercilessly by him, so it's best to ask someone else for these questions. When Zhong Huashan heard this, she suddenly sat up from the sofa and crawled over to Su Li in an unseemly manner. She looked up at him and blinked her eyes. She asked curiously, should I look for that female engineer? She's the chief technical supervisor of Nutshell, and she designed the MX Mecha with you, brother. She must be very good at theoretical physics. Su Li was stunned for a moment. He rubbed her hair and said, she's very busy with work now. Military equipment testing is a long-term job. There's no way she'll be very busy. Zhong Huashan's judgment was clearly sharper than that of her peers. She wrinkled her nose and retorted, you were arranged to do this because the big shots from S1 want to chase you far away. So why is she here too? A military equipment testing doesn't need two technical geniuses like you to be present at the same time, right? Chapter 710. Hearing the little girl's sharp retort that was still filled with curiosity and teasing, Su Li's mind naturally appeared in front of him. The girl was naturally a simpleton with a broad mind, but in fact, the pair of eyes behind the lenses were filled with the brilliance of the Federation's intelligence. Speaking of which, brother, among all your girlfriends, I like her the most. Zhong Huiyan opened her big, bright, innocent eyes and maintained the cute posture of a kitten. She held her face with both hands and stared at Su Li's face close at hand. She said, "She is very beautiful, speaks very simply, never puts on makeup, and her skin is very good. The most important thing is that she has a high IQ, which is a good match for you. The most important thing is that she has big breasts, which you will definitely like very much." Su Lu was still young, but at this moment, he could not help but feel embarrassed. He waved his hand and said angrily, "First, I don't have that many girlfriends. To be precise, I don't have a girlfriend. Second, it seems that I don't need you to evaluate and choose what kind of woman I want to find." A list of explanations. What a typical male student of engineering. Zhong Huiyan sighed helplessly and then seriously retorted, "First, if they're not your girlfriends, why don't they get married? If you don't have a girlfriend, then what is Jian Shuai? Second, you are now my guardian. If you want to find a wife, of course it has something to do with me. Otherwise, what if you find me a vicious stepmother? In the future, if she wants to have children with you, she will definitely not like me. Then let's start from the beginning." Su Lu rubbed his hair in pain and said, "First, even if I find a wife, you can only call her sister-in-law, not stepmother. Second, even if Jian Shuai is my girlfriend, she is not a vicious person. Third, if it is my fault that they don't get married, then what can you find to solve it? I'm not even 12 years old, and you want me to solve the problems between you adults?" Zhong Huiyan opened her eyes wide and screamed, "What is love? How can I understand?" She looked up and continued to explain innocently, "I don't have any bad feelings towards Jian Shuai. I just feel that she should be an idol on TV, just like the doll on my bed. How could I really marry her?" "What's wrong with that?" Su Lu asked, puzzled. "She's a soldier now, not the superstar she used to be. She's a big star. Whether she makes a comeback or not, she's still a big star." Zhong Huashan frowned prettily and said, "I can't imagine the life of the national idol girl in front of me. When I think of her pooping in the bathroom next door, I think of her trimming her nose hair in front of the mirror, or even picking her feet on the sofa we're sitting on. Oh my God." The little girl slapped the sofa cushion with her right hand and sighed exaggeratedly. "Do you know what it means to have your idol disillusioned? In this kind of situation, how heavy of a blow will my young heart suffer?" Su Lu was speechless. He stared blankly at the beautiful little girl in front of him, who had a pretentious and slightly exaggerated expression. He didn't know what was in her head. Only then did he notice that the little girl's posture was extremely indecent. Her smooth and delicate legs were exposed under the nightdress, and a piece of tender skin was exposed at the neckline of the nightdress. He naturally reached out and grabbed her struggling head, made her sit up straight, and lectured her in a deep voice, "You're a big girl now. You have to be careful in the future. Otherwise, if you're seen by outsiders, you'll suffer a big loss." Zhong Huashan laughed a little embarrassedly and quickly buttoned her collar. Su Lu looked at the little girl with picturesque eyebrows and somehow thought of the scene a few years later when little Watermelon, who had become a young girl, had a boyfriend and walked into the family in a wedding dress. His eyes narrowed subconsciously, and his chest was filled with warmth and a faint sense of loss. This fatherly feeling flashed through his mind, and he suddenly thought of a very important question. He frowned and looked at her. After a long while, he hesitated and asked, "How is the school's adolescent education? I saw that there seems to be a task requirement on the parent column in the electronic manual." "Brother, what do you want to ask?" Zhong Huashan opened her big eyes and looked at him curiously. Su Lu was deliberating his words. If Mrs. Zhong was still alive, of course, it wouldn't be his turn to deal with these things. But the problem at hand was that the entire old house in Whaley 2 district was full of a group of special elite men. Even the big fat white rabbits behind seemed to be male. I understand. The clever little girl reacted quickly. She glared at him, put her hand in front of her little face, and said quietly, "First, I haven't come yet. Second, even if I come, I can handle it myself. This doesn't require high IQ. By the way, you don't have to worry about these women in the future." She followed up with a reminder. She grabbed the hem of her nightdress and said angrily, "I'll be shy, okay?" The words woman and shy directly broke down Sue Lee's psychological defense. He stared at the little girl in front of him and was speechless again. After a long time, he came back to his senses. He coughed twice and said, "We'll continue the discussion about the accuracy of quantum physics tomorrow night. Go to sleep quickly. We still have to go to the south tomorrow." Zhong Huashan stood up from the sofa, lifted the hem of her nightdress, and bowed obediently with a smile. Then she rushed to the bedroom screaming. Her short black hair was so cute. The 72nd year of the constitutional calendar was an election year. Before the presidential election in autumn, the first thing to take place was the election of members of parliament and governors at all levels. The Westwoods district was no exception. 1/3 of the district's members of parliament would be rotated. At present, the Federation was peaceful and the whole society was united. In contrast, the West Woods district, which was still in civil strife and the strong infiltration of the Federation, appeared to be in a storm. The election of members of parliament was very important. In order to consolidate or protect the traditional interests of the Zhong family in the West Woods political circle, the Zhong family had to make a strong statement. In the past few days, in addition to his daily studies, Su Lu often had to take Zhong Huashan to various places in the West Woods to support the candidates who were close to or loyal to the Zhong family. As the little princess of the Zhong family, this was the right and duty of Zhong Huashan. She and Su Lu appeared at those election rallies at the same time, which naturally caused waves of cheers and enthusiasm of countless people in the West Woods to vote. In addition to the election, the most important thing in the Federation at present was the funeral. The little girl went upstairs to sleep. In the living room, Su Lu turned on the huge screen that covered the entire wall. Watching the live broadcast of the funeral on the television, his eyes gradually narrowed. It was late at night in the West Woods, but it was still early in the S1 Capital Special District. The snow on Charter Square had long been cleared, and only a little bit of ash and snow remained on the lawn. For some reason, the weather in the Capital Special District was still exceptionally cold, even though it was already spring. Government officials in dark windbreakers, generals in dark green military uniforms, and people of the Federation in black formal slowly came from all directions of the city. Accompanied by the clear morning breeze, they had a sad and calm expression on their faces as they sent off the old man on his last journey. Su Lun narrowed his eyes as he watched the live broadcast of the funeral. Thinking that he should have been there, but had to stay here, he felt a little depressed. And when he saw the black coffin in the middle of Charter Square, surrounded by tens of thousands of white flowers and the military flag covering the coffin, the depression became stronger and stronger, and it was difficult to get rid of for a long time. Li Pifu's last words were very clear. He wanted to be buried in Philadelphia, and he wanted to be buried in the back mountain of Philadelphia instead of the lakeside because he had occupied the beautiful scenery for many years. Since he was dead, he could not let the tomb and the memorial hall continue to occupy it, and it could not be occupied forever. But the funeral had to be held in the Capital Special District, which meant that the body of the old man in the coffin had to bear 2 long trips, which is why Su Lu was so comfortable in the slow-moving camera. It was all black and white. Hundreds of thousands of people stood in silence in Charter Square, listening to President Pabre read the eulogy in a low voice. In the mournful music of Xiao Mu, pigeons flew by. These pigeons were not the pigeons in Charter Square that were too fat to fly because they were fed by tourists, but they came from the Far East, so they flew very fast and firmly. The Federation government, from the president to the vice president, from the minister to the governor, were all present at the funeral. The military, from the commanders of the major military regions to the chiefs of the field armies, were all present, and the veterans wearing military uniforms without epaulets cried the hardest. All the members of the parliament were present, the anti-government military representatives of Green Dragon Mountain were present, and the representatives of the trade unions of the 4 states around the mountain were present. Several weak-looking old men and a lady stood silently on the side of the rostrum. Their expressions were calm, and they did not attract anyone's attention. Even the cameras of the Federation News Channel did not notice them, or did not dare to notice them. The people of the Federation and the hundreds of thousands of people in Charter Square who were watching the live broadcast of the funeral did not know that these ordinary-looking old men represented the seemingly omnipotent 7 families hidden in the shadows of history and folklore. The old men and the ladies looked at the black coffin that was being slowly lifted up, and their eyes were filled with extremely complicated emotions. Some of them were in awe of the person in the coffin, some of them were sad about his departure, and some of them were relaxed that could not be concealed. Because of the person in the coffin, the unknown Lees of Philadelphia had been dazzling in the past few decades, and no one dared to look at them directly. Although that person did not really have a conflict with the 7 families, just sitting silently by the lake like a statue, he suppressed the 7 families and forced them to be low-key and conservative, not daring to act rashly. Such a situation was rare in history, and now that that person had passed away, who in the Federation could suppress these families? At this moment, there was a small commotion in the dense morning crowd in the square. The middle-aged male anchor of the news channel was reviewing the glorious battle history of the military god while explaining the funeral scene. His voice suddenly changed, and even the solemn morning music could not suppress the shock at this moment. The one walking at the front is Miss Jian Shuier. The middle-aged male anchor, the people in the square, and the hundreds of millions of viewers in front of the TV all looked at the girl walking at the front of the group of family members, and all fell into shock at the same time. Jian Shu, dressed in black, was holding the black and white portrait of the military god in her arms, and General Li Feng and General Li Jiedu were standing beside her. Her perfect face, which had fascinated the people of the Federation for many years, was filled with endless sadness. Chapter 711. Seeing Jian Shuier slowly walking forward with the portrait in her hands, Su Li's eyes narrowed again. He subconsciously took a sip of water. The Federation never knew the true family background of this national idol who was once popular throughout the universe, nor did they know why the UNICEF had to fight such a lawsuit with Department 23. Today, she finally revealed her identity at the funeral, but no one could guess the most secretive part of her identity. It was believed that after the funeral, the image of Jian Shuier in black holding the portrait of the war god would immediately spread throughout the universe. Countless news media would definitely dig up the relationship between her and the Lees of Philadelphia. The curiosity of the public would put a lot of pressure on her, but no matter how many factors there were, it was impossible to stop her from rushing back from the front line to attend the funeral. This was because she used to be called Jian Muzi and was picked up by the Lees of Philadelphia from the other side of the universe. She was a daughter who grew up with great care and tolerance. Sula had not seen her for a few days. Usually, they only contacted each other through email. When he found out that she was rushing back to Philadelphia, he sent her a letter of comfort. Other than that, he could not do too much. At this time, looking at her slightly red eyes and haggard and sad face on the news, he was very worried about her. He sat silently on the sofa and silently watched the live broadcast of the funeral. He silently waited until the funeral was over and the Federation News Channel began to play The Man from Philadelphia again. Sulu lowered his head and rubbed his eyebrows. He turned off the TV and then sat silently for a long time again before picking up the phone and dialing a number. Just like in the past, the phone rang precisely 3 times before it was picked up. Then, Shang Xiu's calm voice sounded. There was a trace of warmth, but no surprise in it. "What's the matter?" Is the test over? Sulu asked. Yes, it's not difficult to set up the electromagnetic beam cluster array. You know, the key is the matching formula between the reference positioning and the curvature of the Earth's crust. The old people at the 7th Institute of the Academy of Science have been working on it for half their lives, but they still haven't figured it out. Sulu seemed to be able to see Shang Qiu shrugging indifferently on the other end of the phone. Her plump breasts were trembling, cute and charming. He scratched his head and said, "This research is already difficult, not to mention that it has to be suitable for military use." That's why I didn't blame him. If I had been able to understand mathematics better when I was at Kyoto University, or if I had had more time, I would have done it myself. Shang Qiu said, "I heard that you've been quite free recently. Are you interested in helping out? Don't forget that there's still a spot for you in the Nutshell Engineering Department." Forget it. Sulu only realized that his rejection was a little stiff after he said it out loud. Worried that the other party might have other sensitive thoughts, he quickly explained, "You know that I'm very stupid when it comes to theory, especially when compared to you." Obviously, the genius female engineer on the other end of the phone had zero sensitivity to these things. She said calmly, "I'll do the calculations, and you do the model." After thinking about it, Sulu said, "Okay, when you come back, let's meet and talk." "I'm already back," Shang Qiu said. "We need to wait for the live ammunition data, so the entire research team has been pulled back." "You're at the Golden Star Hotel right now?" Sulu asked in surprise. When he thought about how close she was to the Wei Air Mansion, he couldn't help but feel nervous. "Why? You want to see me?" Shang Qiu said after a pause. She began to tease him a little clumsily, like she did many years ago in the nightclub next to Kyoto University. It was just that young people often didn't understand that teasing would only make them feel embarrassed and embarrassed. I do have some things I want to tell you in person." Jian Shueier's haggard and sorrowful face appeared in Su Li's mind. Although it wasn't a weeping beauty, it was particularly pitiful. Then, holding the hot phone in his hand, he realized that there were many things that he should say, but he didn't know how to say them. Or perhaps, if he dug into the deepest part of a man's heart, he didn't want to say them at all. From his tone, Shang Qiu vaguely understood something. After a moment of silence, she said, "There's no need to be too artistic between us, and you don't have to feel too pressured because I ran away from the wedding." Sulu grunted through his nose. Shang Qiu's next words came quickly and directly, which was very in line with her personality. "But I really think that you are the best choice for my husband. I like you. Do you like me?" Sulu felt that this question was much more difficult than the spring recruitment exam for Nutshell. Like a fool, he stared at the dark screen that had turned off long ago. After thinking for a long time, he directly answered the question, which was also very in line with his personality. "I like you. That's a very good thing," Shang Qiu said calmly on the other end of the phone. "Then the question now is, what do you do if you like a lot of people?" From a biological point of view, male animals will spray their semen all over the universe when they are in heat, and male men are in heat all year round. But the problem is that things like love and marriage are not as simple as being in heat. "I understand, so I don't know what to do." Sulu scratched his hair that hadn't been washed for 3 days and felt his scalp itch. "Am I very shameless?" "You are as shameless as all men," Shang Qiu commented. The two ends of the phone were silent for a long time, so long that even the air felt very awkward. At this time, Shang Qiu suddenly asked, "Have you ever thought that if we have a child, will it become the most amazing engineering genius in history? If it doesn't inherit my looks, then this child will definitely be very beautiful." Sulu added in his heart, "And the child will definitely have a very good figure. Then why don't we try to have a child?" Shang Qiu's voice on the other end of the phone became somewhat erratic, the kind that's secretly. Hearing the word secretly, Su Li's heart failed to live up to his expectations and trembled. His mouth opened in shock, and he couldn't close it or speak. At this critical moment, a burst of chaotic footsteps and a scream came from upstairs. Zhong Huiyin rushed to the side of the stairs and forced herself to suppress the desire to scream. She lifted the hem of her nightdress and took a deep breath. Looking at the stunned Sulu downstairs, she said in a trembling voice, "It's coming." Sulu was stunned for a moment, and then reacted. He suddenly stood up and looked at the tiny red stain on her nightdress, panicked, and said loudly, "You said you can take care of it yourself." The black coffin covered with the bright military flag of the Federation was quietly placed in the main hall of the Memorial Hall of the Federation heroes. At this time, it was already late, and the endless mourners were helplessly blocked outside the gate. They could only express their grief through the glass and the light curtain. After a long secret talk with General Lee Jae-do, the president had already left. After all, there were still countless important matters waiting for him to decide on in the Federation and in the front line. Immediately afterwards, those generals with sorrowful expressions were also gently persuaded away by Li Zidao. These old generals who had followed the war god, Li Zidao, to the north and south in the past were already old, and it was very difficult for them to endure for a long period of time while grieving. In the quiet night, the Lees of Philadelphia guarded the coffin of the old man. Although it was called the Lees, in fact, there were only 3 people. As the night gradually deepened, Jianxue, who was attacked by grief and fatigue, finally couldn't take it anymore. She leaned against the pillar and fell asleep. Lee Jae-do looked at the logistics officer who covered the girl with a green military blanket and waved his hand to call Li Feng over. "Send your aunt to the room next door to rest. Also, tell the Ministry of National Defense not to let the reporters disturb her for the next few days." General Lee Jae-do gently asked the staff to go to rest. Then he walked to the side doors on both sides and gently closed them. At this time, he was the only one left in the spacious memorial hall of the Federation heroes. There was also a black coffin covered with the Federation's military flag. He moved a stool to the side of the black coffin, took off his military cap, and casually placed it on the black coffin. Then he sat down and let out an almost inaudible sigh. The spacious hall was dimly lit. Lee Jae-do gently placed his palm on the black coffin. His expression was calm. His gray hair, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, and his tired expression gradually merged with the atmosphere. Suddenly, he turned his head and quietly looked at the black coffin. His gaze seemed to want to penetrate the thick, specially made coffin and look at his father lying quietly in the military flag. Just like that, Lee Jae-do sat beside the coffin for an entire night. He didn't speak, didn't drink, didn't eat, just sat there in silence. His palm was always calmly placed on the black coffin. Until early morning, when a new day arrived, the sky outside the window seemed to be shining. Lee Jae-do's hair seemed to be whiter, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes seemed to be deeper. He was increasingly tired. Then he calmly said to the black coffin, "Father, before you fell ill, there are some things I didn't have time to tell you. Today, I want to tell you. No matter how great a person is, there will come a day when he will rot. Take you, for example. Perhaps in just one night, your body is already decayed. The only thing that can make the Federation, make your spirit immortal forever, is the system, the brand new system that has undergone change. Yes, the people in this part of the universe are afraid of change. The people who have been fooled don't know the necessity of change. Those vultures who have attached themselves to the rotting corpses of the people for 10,000 years hate change. They who control the parliament will never allow this kind of change to happen. Fortunately, the enemies in the universe have given us an extremely good reason, and you have given the strong and brave army an unprecedented position in the Federation, receiving the love and respect of the people. The current Federation has the best opportunity, and it may also be the last opportunity." He stood up and carefully put on his military cap. Facing his father in the coffin, he adjusted his military appearance for the last time. Calmly and full of determination, he said, "Father, I intend to do this. You will definitely be proud of me." After giving the military salute, Lee Jae-do turned and left. Monotonous footsteps echoed in the dark hall of the Memorial Hall of Heroes. The black coffin covered by the military flag seemed particularly lonely. It was unknown whether the old man in the coffin would be proud, but in any case, he could no longer speak. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.